Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was traveling back from a work trip, just waiting for my transfer at this train station a couple hours from home. My train wasn't due for another 40 minutes, so I was just killing time, wandering around, checking my phone now and then. At some point, I started feeling the coffee I'd had earlier catching up to me, so I went to find the restroom. The station itself was kind of run down, not dirty exactly, but worn. That restroom was empty when I went in, 3 stalls and a couple of urinals. No music, just the faint echo of a train announcement from outside. I went to the farthest stall and shut the door. I was sitting there, checking my phone to pass the time, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was something poking out from under the stall door across from me. At first, I thought maybe someone had dropped something, but then I realized it was moving slightly, shifting up and down, as if adjusting. It took me a second to process, but then I saw what it was, the lens of a phone camera. Someone was recording me. I froze. My heart started racing, but I kept still, trying not to make any sudden movements. I didn't want them to know I'd noticed. I felt sick, but I stayed as calm as I could, breathing slow, waiting. After what felt like forever, the phone finally pulled back, just as silently as it had come. I waited a couple of seconds, then stood up as quietly as possible, barely touching the stall walls. I listened. I didn't hear footsteps or anything, just silence, and I thought maybe they were still there. I felt trapped, like if I opened the door, they'd be right on the other side. My mind was racing, going through every option. Should I open it fast, scare them? Or wait and see if they left first? I decided I couldn't stay in there. I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out. I glanced around quickly, looking at the other stalls. Nothing. Empty. Whoever it was had left. I didn't waste any time. I went straight out of there. Back in the main part of the station, it felt safer, but I was still on edge, looking over my shoulder every few steps. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was probably just some creep who'd gotten what he wanted and left. But even with all the people around, I didn't feel right. Then, my phone buzzed. I didn't think anything of it at first, figured it was just a work email or something, but then I looked and saw it was a text from an unknown number. All it said was, "Nice to see you." I stopped walking, my stomach turning. I thought maybe it was someone messing with me, but then my phone buzzed again. "Hope you're enjoying your trip." I didn't respond. I looked around, searching faces, but no one seemed to be looking at me. Everyone was just moving along, like nothing was wrong. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and walked faster toward the station exit, thinking maybe I'd just wait outside where there were more people around. But then another text came through. "Leaving already?" I couldn't believe it. My hands started shaking. I'd seen enough movies to know that this wasn't a coincidence, but I couldn't figure out how they could know I was leaving, let alone what they were getting at. I didn't know if I should respond, but another message came before I had the chance to decide. "You look a little nervous." It felt like a punch to the gut. That meant they were still watching. I took a breath and looked around, trying to act casual while scanning the station, but nothing. No one was paying me any special attention. I typed back, "Who's this?" I watched the screen, waiting, hoping they'd slip up and give me some hint. A few seconds later, the reply came through. "Don't worry about that. We're just having a little fun." I felt like I was going to be sick. I had this overwhelming feeling that whoever was doing this wasn't far away, maybe even close enough to see the expression on my face. I typed, "This isn't funny," and hit send. This time, there was a longer pause, and I thought maybe they'd finally given up. But just as I let out a breath, another message appeared. "Isn't it?" I didn't respond. Instead, I headed straight for the nearest security guard. He was standing by the main entrance, a big guy, older, looked like he'd seen a lot. I explained as quickly as I could, showing him the messages, telling him what happened in the restroom. He took my phone, scrolling through the texts, and frowned. "Have you tried calling this number?" he asked. I hadn't, so I pulled out my phone, dialed the number, and pressed call. It rang, but no one picked up. Just a normal ring, no busy signal, no weird noises. Just a regular, endless ring. The guard advised me to stay close to him, and he called in another security officer to help check the restroom in the station for anyone who might be acting suspicious. I stayed where I was, my back against the wall, watching them head toward the restroom while I kept looking around, nervous, but no one around me seemed unusual. Then, my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look, but I did. The text said, "You really shouldn't have done that." I looked over at the guard, wanting to show him the message, but I was frozen, staring at the screen. Just then, one of the guards walked back over to me, shaking his head. "No one in there, and no sign of anything left behind," he said, looking around. I showed him the new text. He frowned, his face getting serious. He asked me to stay put, and then both guards left to check around the rest of the station, telling me they'd be right back. Alone, I felt completely vulnerable. I kept glancing around, gripping my phone tight, looking at every face that passed by, every figure in the distance. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was over, that the guards were on it. But my phone buzzed one last time. This time, it was a photo. A picture of me, taken just minutes before, standing in the same spot by the wall, looking as lost and scared as I felt. The message with it just said, "See you around." My stomach dropped. I looked around wildly, my head spinning, my breath caught in my throat. But I didn't see anyone holding up a phone, no one pointing a camera at me, no one acting like they were watching me. It felt like every single person in that station was in on it, every face a threat. When the guards came back, I told them about the picture, showed them the message, and one of them looked at the other, nodding slightly. They told me to wait right there, then they brought in another officer. I went through the whole story again, every detail, every text. They asked for my phone and took it to the back, saying they'd try to trace the number, find out where the messages were coming from. The next train home was announced over the loudspeakers, and they advised me to board, saying they'd follow up. I didn't argue. I just wanted to leave. I got on that train, found my seat, and just sat there, looking out the window. I didn't get any more messages on the ride home, and I barely slept that night. A couple of days later, I got a call from the station security. They told me they couldn't trace the number. It was from some throwaway line that disconnected as soon as I'd left the station. They checked the cameras, but the quality wasn't good enough to make out any faces clearly. No leads, they said. It's been months now, but every time I'm out, every time I get on a train, I feel that same prickling on the back of my neck. Like someone's watching. Like somewhere, someone has a picture of me, just waiting for the right moment. I was out late that night, later than I usually stay up. I couldn't sleep, so I thought a walk might help clear my head. The air was cool, and the beach was quiet, the waves just rolling in and out with that steady sound. There wasn't anyone else around that I could see, and that was the whole point. I wanted to be alone, just me and the sound of the ocean. I was a little way down the shore, maybe a mile or so from the nearest beach access, when I first saw it. Out there, a bit past where the waves started to break, there was someone standing in the water. It was dark, so at first I thought it might have been some driftwood or a buoy or something. But as I got closer, I could see it was definitely a person, a man. He was just standing there, chest deep in the water, facing toward the shore. Facing me. He wasn't moving. I stopped walking. I didn't know what to think at first. Maybe it was someone fishing, or just messing around out there, but something about the way he stood so still, with the water pushing and pulling at his body, didn't look right. His arms hung at his sides, and he didn't seem to be struggling or anything, just standing there. And he was staring right at me. I kept my distance, just standing there on the sand, wondering what I should do. I didn't want to get too close to the water. It was cold, and there was a rip current warning out earlier in the day. I wasn't about to go wading in to check on some guy who might have just been drunk or something. I took a step back, and that's when he moved. It was slow, just a small shift, but his head tilted to the side, like he was studying me. His eyes didn't leave mine. I could just barely make out his face in the moonlight. He didn't look scared or desperate like someone who needed help would. He looked calm, if that makes any sense. Calm in a way that felt wrong, like he was waiting for something. I turned to keep walking, trying to pretend like I didn't see him. My heart was starting to pick up a bit, but I told myself it was nothing, just some weird guy in the water. I didn't owe him anything. I wasn't going to get involved. I glanced back after a few steps, just to see if he'd gone back to whatever he was doing. He was closer. He'd taken a few steps toward the shore, the water now up to his waist. He was still staring at me, and I froze. There was something in the way he moved, how slow and deliberate his steps were. I took another step back, and he moved again, matching me. This time his head tilted to the other side, like he was listening for something. I felt a chill go down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air. I started to back away faster, putting more distance between us. Every time I took a step, he'd move too, dragging himself closer to the shore, always keeping his eyes on me. He wasn't running or splashing around. It was like he was pacing himself, but for what, I didn't know. I turned around and started walking faster, trying to shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear the waves behind me, the sound of them getting softer as I got farther from the water. I was almost at the dune when I glanced back again. He was out of the water now, standing on the wet sand. His clothes clung to him, dark and soaked, and his feet were sinking a bit into the muck. But his eyes, they didn't look like they were seeing the beach. They were fixed on me, as if he was locked in, and there was no expression on his face. No anger, no fear, no nothing. Just blank. That's when I started running. I didn't know why, and I felt stupid for it, but my legs just took over, and I was running up the beach, past the dunes, and onto the packed path that led back to the road. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I ran, and every time, he was still there, still walking after me, never speeding up, just keeping that slow, steady pace. I couldn't hear him, though. That's what was strange. You'd think I would have heard his footsteps on the sand, the slap of wet feet hitting the ground, but there was nothing. Just my own breathing and the thump of my heartbeat in my ears. When I reached the path, I thought I was safe. I told myself he wouldn't follow me off the beach, that maybe he was just some crazy guy who liked to scare people. But as I reached the top of the dune and looked back, there he was, coming up the path behind me, still walking. It was like he knew exactly how much distance to keep, like he didn't need to rush because he'd catch up with me eventually. I kept running. I couldn't help it. I ran until my lungs burned, and the beach was far behind me, But when I looked back, there he was, always there, never losing sight of me. I turned down a side road, hoping to lose him in the dark. The streetlights were few and far between out there, and it felt like I was running into a black tunnel. I could see a few houses in the distance, all with their lights off, and I thought about banging on one of their doors. But then I thought, what if he sees me do that? What if he waits outside? What if he knows I'm in there? So, I kept running, weaving through streets, taking random turns, trying to make sure he couldn't keep up. I was gasping for air, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I had to stop for a second, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, just like before. I looked up and saw him, just a little way down the street. It was like no matter where I went, he knew exactly where I was. He'd just keep finding me. There was no running from him. I turned down the nearest driveway and ran toward a house with a dim porch light on. I banged on the door, not even caring if I woke someone up or scared them. I just needed to get inside, away from him. I glanced back, and I saw him standing at the end of the driveway, his shadow stretching out toward me in the light. The door opened, and a man stepped out, looking half asleep. I pushed past him, breathless, trying to explain what was happening, but it all came out as a jumbled mess. I pointed down the driveway, but when I looked back, the man wasn't there anymore. He was gone, like he'd never even been there at all. The guy who answered the door thought I was some kind of nutcase. I could see it in his eyes, but he let me use his phone to call someone. I called my friend and had him come pick me up. I didn't leave the house until my friend pulled up in his car, and I made him stay on the line with me the whole time. We drove around a bit before heading back to my place. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see that guy walking down the street, but I never saw him again. I don't know what he wanted, why he was out there, or how he always seemed to know where I was. It's been a few weeks since that happened, and I haven't been back to the beach since. I don't think I ever will. I still feel like there's someone watching me sometimes, like those eyes are still on me, even though I haven't seen him again. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm not taking any chances. I don't go out alone at night anymore. I don't know if that's enough to keep him away, but it's the only thing that makes me feel a little safer. I was driving through this small town I'd never been to before. I wasn't planning on staying or anything, just passing through, but I saw this little church and felt like I should stop. I'd been going through a rough time, just needed some quiet or something familiar, I guess. The church wasn't big or fancy, just an old building with a sign out front that said Sunday service. It was starting soon, so I figured I'd go in. There weren't many cars in the lot, but I thought maybe it was just a small congregation. When I stepped inside, the place was quiet, almost too quiet. I'd expected to hear some music or people talking, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my shoes on the wooden floor. The whole church had this dim lighting, and the air smelled kind of stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. I saw about 15 or 20 people sitting in the pews, spread out, not really talking to each other. Nobody even looked up when I came in. I walked down the aisle and took a seat near the back, figured I'd just stay for a bit and then leave if I didn't feel comfortable. But then I started noticing the way people were acting. They weren't really praying or talking, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. I kept glancing around, trying to catch someone's eye or give a little nod like you do, but every time I looked at someone, they'd just look away real fast. It felt weird, like they were purposely ignoring me. I thought about leaving right then, but the service was about to start, and I figured I'd just sit through a bit of it before heading out. When the pastor came out, he didn't really seem like any pastor I'd ever seen before. He didn't have the kind of welcoming look you'd expect. He was tall, thin, had this worn-out black suit on, and his face was pale, with these deep-set eyes that made it look like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't smile or greet the congregation, just stood up at the pulpit and started talking in this flat voice. There was no opening hymn or prayer, just him speaking. He was saying something about devotion, but it wasn't like any sermon I'd heard before. It felt off, like the words didn't fit right. It was hard to explain. He'd keep pausing, looking around the room like he was making sure everyone was paying attention. Every time he did, I felt this uneasy feeling in my stomach, like I shouldn't have come there at all. After about 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up quietly and started to walk toward the back. But before I could reach the doors, I noticed two men standing on either side of the exit. They hadn't been there when I came in, I was sure of it. They were big guys, both wearing these dark suits that looked almost identical. They were just standing there, staring straight ahead, but I could tell they were watching me. I tried to act casual and walked a little slower, not wanting to draw any attention to myself, but just as I was a few feet away from the doors, I heard the pastor's voice echo through the room. "Where are you going?" he asked. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence in a way that made everyone turn and look at me. I froze, not sure what to say. I was just stepping out for a moment, I replied, my voice sounding shaky even to me. The pastor didn't say anything else, but I noticed that everyone in the pews was now looking at me. Their expressions didn't look concerned or curious, they looked blank, like they were waiting for something. I took another step toward the door, but the two men moved closer, just enough that I knew they weren't going to let me through. I looked back toward the pastor, and he was just staring at me with that same flat expression, like he was studying me. "I think I need to leave," I said, louder this time, but nobody moved or said a word. It was like I was trapped in some kind of strange theater where everyone knew the script but me. The pastor took a step down from the pulpit, slowly walking toward me, his shoes clicking against the floor. "You should stay," he said. "We haven't even gotten to the important part yet." My heart was racing now. I glanced at the windows, thinking maybe I could get out that way, but they were high up and had thick glass. There wasn't a chance I could break through. I took another step back, and the two men at the door stepped closer, blocking my path completely. I was starting to panic, and I didn't care if it showed. "Let me out," I said, my voice breaking a little. "I'm not staying here." Nobody answered. The pastor stopped walking and just stood there, watching me, his head tilted slightly like he was amused or something. I didn't know what else to do, so I turned and ran up the aisle, trying to get to a side door I'd seen near the front. But as I reached for the handle, I felt someone grab my arm. I looked back, and one of the men in the suits had a tight grip on me, his face still expressionless. I pulled away as hard as I could and managed to break free, stumbling back into the aisle. The other people were starting to stand up now, moving slowly like they weren't in any hurry. They weren't saying anything, just closing in on me from all sides. I bolted toward the other side of the room, where there was another door. I didn't know where it led, but it was my only shot. I reached it and shoved it open, running into a narrow hallway lined with old wooden doors. It looked like some kind of storage area or offices. I didn't care. I just kept running, trying to find an exit. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. I didn't stop to see who it was, just ran faster, shoving open doors as I went, hoping one would lead outside. Most of them were just closets or small rooms, but finally, I found one that led to a back stairwell. I took the steps two at a time, almost tripping over myself, and when I got to the bottom, I saw a door leading outside. I pushed it open and stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. I got in and locked the doors, looking back at the church. The pastor was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't come after me, didn't say anything, just stood there with that same blank expression. There were a few other people behind him, standing just inside the door, but none of them came outside. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I started the car and sped out of there, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out, but the way they looked at me, it was like they were all waiting for something, like I was supposed to be part of it, whatever it was. I still don't understand what was going on in there, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. All I know is that wasn't a church service. At least, not the kind I've ever been to. And whatever they were planning, I'm just glad I didn't stick around to find out. I was driving alone on a long stretch of highway, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. The trip was supposed to be a straight shot, but I'd left later than I planned and ended up driving through the night. I didn't mind at first. It was quiet, peaceful even. But as the hours dragged on, my eyelids got heavier, and I knew I needed a break. It was close to midnight when I saw the lights of a diner ahead. There wasn't much else around, just empty road and darkness, so the glowing sign felt like a relief. Darlene's Diner, it said. It looked like the kind of place that probably hadn't changed in decades. Old neon sign, a row of booths along the windows, and a counter with swivel stools. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under my tires, and parked near the entrance. Inside, the place was mostly empty, except for a few people scattered at the tables. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and a woman behind the counter immediately smiled at me. Too wide, like she'd been waiting for me. "Evening, hon," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "Just you tonight?" I nodded and took a seat at one of the booths by the window. It was quieter in there than I expected. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The air felt heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. The woman behind the counter, Darlene, I guess from the sign, came over with a menu, but I didn't need to look at it. I just wanted coffee, something to keep me awake. "Just coffee, please," I said. She gave me another too-wide smile and headed back behind the counter. I glanced around, feeling uneasy for reasons I couldn't quite explain. There were maybe 4 other people in the diner, all sitting at different tables. None of them were eating. In fact, they weren't doing anything at all. Just sitting there, staring ahead, their eyes blank. I tried not to make eye contact with them, but it was hard not to notice. One man sat in a booth across from me, his hands resting on the table, completely still. His eyes didn't move, didn't blink. He was staring directly at me. I shifted in my seat, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Darlene came back with my coffee, setting it down in front of me with a soft clink. I tried to give her a polite smile, but it felt forced. The whole place was off, like stepping into a dream where nothing quite makes sense. "Where are you headed?" Darlene asked, lingering by my table. "Just passing through," I said, taking a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. She nodded slowly, like she knew more than she was letting on. Not many folks come through here this time of night. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and glanced out the window, hoping the conversation would end. The diner's parking lot was empty except for my car, and beyond that was just darkness. No other buildings, no streetlights. Just the road disappearing into the black. I started to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. The silence in the diner was deafening now, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. I glanced back at the other customers, and my stomach turned when I realized they were all looking at me. Every single one of them. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. I looked down at my coffee, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked up again, they were still staring. "Everything all right, Han?" Darlene's voice made me jump. She was standing behind the counter, her hands resting on it as she watched me closely. Too closely. "I'm fine," I said, my voice a little shaky. "I think I'll get the check." Her smile didn't falter, but something changed in her eyes. She didn't move. "You sure you don't want anything to eat? We make a great pie." "No, I'm good, really," I said, standing up quickly. I grabbed my jacket, ready to leave. But when I turned toward the door, my heart stopped. The door was locked. I hadn't noticed it when I came in, but now there was a heavy chain looped through the handles, secured with a padlock. I turned back to Darlene, my mouth dry. "Why is the door locked?" She didn't answer right away, just kept smiling at me like nothing was wrong. "Oh, don't worry about that. It's for your own safety. Lots of strange folks out on the road at night." I took a step back, my pulse racing. "I think I'd like to go now." Darlene tilted her head, her smile never leaving her face. "You haven't finished your coffee." I looked around, desperate for a way out. The other customers hadn't moved, still sitting there like mannequins, their eyes locked on me. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Unlock the door." Darlene didn't move. Instead, she walked over to the counter, her heels clicking on the tile, and picked up a phone. She held it in her hand, watching me. "I'll just give our friend a call. He'll want to know you're here." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I bolted for the back of the diner, hoping there was another exit. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. I ran past the kitchen, the smell of grease and old food hanging in the air, and pushed open a door that led to a narrow hallway. At the end of it, I saw a door marked exit. I nearly cried with relief as I sprinted toward it. But when I reached it and pushed on the handle, it didn't budge. The door was locked, just like the front. Panic set in, real and sharp. I pounded on the door, hoping maybe someone outside could hear me, but I knew it was pointless. There was no one around for miles. I turned around, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway. It was one of the men from the diner, the one who had been sitting closest to me. He was walking toward me, his face blank, his eyes fixed on mine. "Darlene says you should come back," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. I backed away, my hands fumbling for something, anything to defend myself with. But there was nothing. Just a dead end and a locked door. He kept coming, his eyes never leaving mine. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I ran past him, back into the diner, hoping maybe I could smash a window or find something heavy to break the lock on the door. But when I got back to the front, Darlene was waiting for me, her smile gone now, replaced with something colder, darker. She was holding a set of keys in her hand, dangling them in front of her like bait. "You're not leaving until he gets here," she said, her voice low. "You might as well sit down." I felt the room spinning, my vision narrowing. Who was he? What did they want with me? I didn't care. I just wanted out. Without thinking, I grabbed a chair and swung it at the window, shattering the glass. The sound was deafening, but I didn't stop to look back. I climbed through the broken window, cutting my hands on the shards, and ran to my car. The gravel crunched under my feet as I fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with blood and sweat. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and peeled out of the lot, not daring to look back. As I sped down the highway, the diner's lights disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. It was around 10:30 when the first call came in. The office was quiet, just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional clicking of my keyboard. I was halfway through my night shift, working late like I always did. My job at this small office was usually boring but predictable. I liked the quiet, and it helped me focus. I'd been answering emails when the phone rang. I remember thinking it was odd because the office line never rang that late. Most people didn't even know I worked the night shift alone. I picked up the receiver without really thinking about it, expecting maybe a wrong number. "Hello?" I said. There was a pause. Nothing but silence on the other end. Just when I was about to hang up, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate breathing. My skin prickled, and I pulled the phone away from my ear, looking at it like that would help. The silence stretched for what felt like forever before the line finally went dead. I hung up, feeling a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. Wrong number, I told myself. Probably some idiot playing a prank. I tried to shake it off, went back to typing, but I couldn't focus. The office felt too quiet now. I glanced at the clock. Only 15 minutes had passed since the call, but I could feel the seconds dragging. Then, the phone rang again. I picked it up a bit slower this time. "Hello?" A voice. This time, there was a voice. Low, almost like a whisper, but I could hear it. "You're wearing a black sweater." I froze. I looked down at my sweater, the one I always wore when the office got cold. The words hung in the air, cold and deliberate. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're wearing a black sweater, and your hair is pulled back," the voice said again, clearer this time. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Whoever this was, they could see me. I felt my heart start to race, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I looked around the office, scanning the dark corners, the doorways, the windows. But the blinds were down. I couldn't see out, and as far as I knew, no one could see in. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound tough, but my voice was shaking. The line clicked, and the call ended. I put the phone down, my hands trembling. I stood up, walking to the door that led out to the hallway. I checked the lock. It was secure. The front door was the only way in, and it required a key card after hours. No one should have been able to get inside without one. I told myself it was just a prank, maybe someone from the office messing with me. But my gut was telling me something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I sat back down at my desk, but I couldn't focus on my work. I kept glancing at the phone, half expecting it to ring again. I looked around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. The office wasn't big, just a few desks, filing cabinets, and the small break room in the back. But it felt massive right then, too much space for me to cover with just my eyes. My pulse hadn't slowed down, and I was getting more and more anxious. I could feel sweat start to gather on my palms. I thought about calling my boss, or maybe even the police, but what would I tell them? Someone called me and described my clothes. It sounded ridiculous in my head. Then the phone rang again. I jumped, nearly knocking over my coffee. My hand hovered over the receiver, not wanting to answer but knowing I had to. Slowly, I picked it up. "I like the way you've tied your hair," the voice said immediately. My blood turned to ice. My hands flew up to my head, feeling the ponytail I'd pulled my hair into just before my shift started. Whoever was calling me, they weren't guessing. They were seeing me, right then, in real time. I stood up from my chair so fast it nearly tipped over. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted into the phone, my voice shaking. Silence again. Just the sound of breathing, slow and measured, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were calm. The opposite of how I felt. "Where are you?" I demanded. The line went dead again. I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. I ran to the windows, pulling the blinds back and peering out into the parking lot. It was dark, barely lit by a single streetlight near the entrance. I couldn't see anyone. No cars besides mine. No movement. Nothing. I went back to the door, checking the lock again, making sure it was still secure. It was. The office was locked up tight. There was no way anyone could get in without me knowing. But that didn't matter. Someone was watching me. Somehow, they were watching me, and they were close enough to know exactly what I was wearing, exactly how I looked. I grabbed my phone, my personal one, and dialed 911. My fingers were trembling so badly that I had to press the buttons twice. 911, what's your emergency? I explained what was happening, trying to stay calm, but my words were coming out in a rush. The operator asked me to slow down, to explain again. I told her I was alone in the office, that someone was calling me, describing what I was wearing, watching me somehow. "Are you sure the building is secure?" she asked. "Yes," I said, glancing at the locked door again. "There's no way in without a key card. I'm the only one here." "Stay on the line," she said. "We're sending someone over." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, pacing the room, the phone pressed to my ear. I kept looking at the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in. But there was nothing. Just the empty parking lot outside. Then my office phone rang again. I stared at it, my heart pounding. The operator was still on the line with me, but my eyes were locked on the office phone, its shrill ring cutting through the quiet. "Are you still there?" the operator asked. "Yes," I whispered, barely able to speak. The phone rang again. "Don't answer it," she said firmly. "Just stay where you are. Officers are on their way." But I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I had to hear what they were going to say this time. I reached out with a shaking hand and picked up the receiver. "Stop calling me," I shouted, my voice cracking. There was a long pause. Then, that same low voice. "You shouldn't have done that." I froze, my blood running cold. "What?" "You shouldn't have called them." The phone went dead again. I dropped the receiver like it had burned me. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I staggered to the window again, pulling the blinds aside, searching the darkness outside for any sign of movement. But the parking lot was empty. No one there. Except there was. Someone had to be out there, watching me. I backed away from the window, my back pressing up against the wall. I didn't feel safe anymore, not even with the doors locked. Whoever this was, they knew too much. They were too close. The operator was still on the line, telling me to stay calm, that help was coming. But I couldn't think straight. My thoughts were racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, I saw the flash of red and blue lights through the blinds. The police had arrived. I ran to the door, unlocking it as quickly as I could. 2 officers came inside, their faces serious, asking me questions. I told them everything, about the calls, about the voice describing what I was wearing, about the way they knew I'd called for help. They checked the building, every room, every closet, every corner. But they found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No one outside. No one watching. The phone calls, though, they believed me about that. They checked the logs and saw the incoming calls, but there was no trace. No number. Whoever it was had blocked it. I never found out who was watching me that night. The police couldn't track the calls, and the office was secure, just like I thought. But I quit that job the next day. I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains for a few days, to clear my head. I'd been feeling overwhelmed by work and just life in general, so some time alone seemed like a good idea. The cabin was pretty remote, about an hour from the nearest town, surrounded by trees and nothing else. It was small but cozy, wooden walls, a fireplace, and a big window that looked out into the woods. I liked the isolation. It felt like I could breathe out there, away from the noise of the city. The first day was peaceful. I spent the afternoon reading by the window, the silence of the forest relaxing. I didn't see anyone else around, and I kind of liked that. It felt like the whole world was just me and the trees. When night fell, I lit the fireplace and curled up in bed. The sound of the fire crackling was the only thing I heard as I drifted off to sleep. The second night was different. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was pitch black in the cabin, except for the faint glow of the dying fire. At first, I didn't know why I was awake, but then I heard footsteps. Soft, steady footsteps just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it must be an animal. I'd seen deer and heard some other creatures rustling around during the day, so it wasn't crazy to think something was wandering around out there. But as I lay there, listening, something about the sound made me uneasy. It was too regular, too deliberate. Not like the skittering of a deer or the shuffle of a small animal. These were slow, heavy footsteps, like someone was walking, taking their time. I sat up in bed, my heart beating faster now. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the isolation messing with my head. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin. I could hear them moving, first near the front door, then around to the side, then the back. It was like someone or something was walking around, checking the place out. I got out of bed and crept toward the window, trying to be as quiet as possible. The moon was bright enough that I could see the outline of the trees outside, casting shadows on the ground. I pressed my face close to the glass, looking out, but I didn't see anyone. Just the empty woods. The footsteps had stopped by then, and I stood there for a long moment, my breath fogging up the glass, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe it really was an animal. Maybe it had just wandered off. But then I saw them. Footprints. Fresh, clear footprints in the dirt, just below the window. They weren't there before. They circled the cabin, just like I heard. My stomach twisted into a knot as I realized what I was looking at: human footprints, not animal. Someone had been walking around the cabin in the middle of the night. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but when I picked it up, I saw that there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was too far out, too deep in the woods. I was on my own. I stood in the middle of the cabin, trying to decide what to do. Should I stay inside? Go out and check? Every instinct in me was screaming to stay put, to lock the doors and wait until morning. but I also couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like whoever had been out there might still be around, waiting. The footsteps hadn't started up again, and after a few minutes, I started to calm down. Maybe they were gone. Maybe it was some random hiker who'd gotten lost. That was possible, right? I told myself it was nothing, just some harmless wanderer who had passed by. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept listening, waiting for the footsteps to return, but they didn't. The cabin was silent again, and eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was morning, and the sun was streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought maybe I dreamed the whole thing. But when I stepped outside, the footprints were still there. They were clearer in the daylight, and I could see exactly how they circled the cabin over and over. They stopped at the front door, and for the first time, I noticed something else: handprints. Faint smudges on the glass of the door, like someone had pressed their palms against it, watching from the outside. I felt sick. Whoever it was hadn't just walked around, they tried to look in. They'd been close enough to touch the door, to see inside. I thought about the way I'd stood at the window, looking out. Had they been watching me? I didn't want to stay another night. I packed up my things quickly, throwing them into my bag without caring if I was being neat. The whole time, I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see someone standing there. My car was parked a short walk from the cabin, just down a dirt path. As I stepped outside, the silence of the woods felt different, heavy, like the trees were watching me, like the whole forest was waiting. I hurried to the car, my bag slung over my shoulder, my keys clutched in my hand. I didn't even bother locking the cabin behind me. I just wanted to get out of there. But when I got to the car, I stopped. Something was wrong. The driver's side door was slightly open, just enough for me to notice. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure I'd locked the car when I arrived, but now the door was cracked, like someone had been inside. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Had they broken in? Were they still here? I didn't want to open the door, but I had to. I needed to see if anything was missing. Slowly, I pulled the door open, bracing myself for what I might find. The car looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place at first. But then I saw a piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting on the driver's seat. I hadn't put it there. My hand shook as I reached for it, unfolding it slowly. There was only one word written on it, in neat, careful handwriting. Why? That was all it said. Just one word, scrawled in black ink. I stared at it, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of it. Why what? Why had I come here? Why was I leaving? I didn't wait to find out. I threw the note on the ground, jumped into the car, and slammed the door shut. My hands were trembling so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, dirt and gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, about an hour away. My heart didn't stop racing until I was surrounded by people again, by the noise and safety of civilization. I don't know who was out there that night, or why they were watching me. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't bring myself to even look at it online again. I had been driving all day, crossing through a bunch of small towns, heading for the cabin my sister had lent me for a weekend away. It was supposed to be peaceful, but my car started making this weird rattling sound as soon as I got off the main road. I didn't want to take any chances, especially since I didn't know the area, so when I saw a little repair shop in this quiet, almost empty town, I pulled in. The sign said Ben's Auto Repair, and there was an old pickup truck parked outside. The place looked a bit run down, but there wasn't much else around, and the idea of getting stranded with a broken car made me anxious. The bell on the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I saw the mechanic behind the counter. He was an older man, greasy hands, coveralls that were way past their prime, and a thick layer of stubble on his face. "Car trouble?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag and looking me over. "Yeah, it's making a weird noise. Kind of a rattling my drive." "I'm not sure what it is," I told him. He nodded and followed me outside to the car. He bent down, looking under the hood, tapping a few parts here and there, not really saying anything. After a few minutes, he straightened up and wiped his hands again. "Hard to say just looking at it," he muttered. "But I think I'll need to keep it overnight. Could be something with the engine, might be the transmission, not sure yet." I hesitated. I wasn't planning on staying in town, just passing through. "How long will it take to fix?" "Depends on what I find," he said, scratching at his stubble. "But I won't know until I can get in there. I'll need to keep it overnight for sure." I didn't really have much choice. The idea of driving on with a potentially serious issue wasn't worth it. "All right," I said. "I'll come back in the morning." "There's a motel a couple streets down," he said, pointing vaguely to the left. "Not much else to do here, so you might as well get comfortable." I nodded, grabbed my bag from the car, and started walking. The town was tiny, barely a few streets, and not many people around. The motel he mentioned was an old building with a neon sign that buzzed quietly in the afternoon heat. I checked in, and the clerk, a young woman who barely looked up from her phone, gave me a key without much conversation. The room was basic, clean enough, though the carpet was stained and the bedspread was worn thin. I figured it was just for one night, so it didn't bother me much. That night, I tried to relax, but the thought of my car sitting in that shop kept creeping into my mind. The whole place felt off. The motel, the town, the mechanic. Everything was just a little too quiet. But I pushed the thoughts away, reminding myself that it was probably just nerves. After all, I was in an unfamiliar place, and I was anxious about the car. I went to bed early and didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening to strange noises outside, though I couldn't tell if they were real or just my imagination. By morning, I was ready to get out of there and back on the road. I walked back to the shop as soon as it opened. The mechanic was already there, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up when I came in, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. "Your car's ready," he said, too quickly. "Already? What was wrong with it?" I asked. "Nothing serious," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just a loose part under the hood. Tightened it up for you. Should be fine now." I looked at him, then glanced outside at my car. It was sitting in the exact same spot I'd left it in, and it didn't look like it had been moved or touched. The windows were covered in the same layer of dust, the tires hadn't even been rotated. I felt my stomach tighten, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I just wanted to leave. I paid him, though I noticed he didn't charge me much, just enough to cover what he claimed was basic labor. I thanked him and left. As I got into the car and started driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The car still made the same faint rattling sound, and I had a sinking suspicion that he hadn't done anything at all. It wasn't until I was a few miles out of town, back on the road, that I got the first message. My phone buzzed from the passenger seat, and I glanced over at the screen. It was an unknown number, but the message caught my eye immediately. "Nice blue jacket." I froze. I was wearing a blue jacket. I hadn't taken it off since I left the motel. My heart started pounding, but I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had seen me in town. Maybe it was a prank. A minute later, another message came in. You left your bag in the back seat. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly on the empty road. I looked into the back seat, and sure enough, my bag was lying there. I hadn't even noticed it when I got in. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone, staring at the screen. How could anyone know that? Another message, heading west, huh? Long drive ahead. I felt sick. Someone was watching me. Someone knew exactly where I was, what I was doing. I looked around, but the road was empty. There were no other cars, no houses, just endless fields and sky. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone was sending me creepy messages? They'd probably just tell me to block the number. I tried that, but a minute later, another message came through from a different number. Did you sleep well last night? I threw my phone onto the passenger seat, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't go back to that town. I couldn't drive to the cabin either. I didn't know what to do. The messages kept coming, each one more personal than the last. They described my every move, my every stop. Whoever it was, they were watching me, following me. By the time I reached the nearest city, I was a wreck. I parked in a busy lot, surrounded by people, hoping that the crowd would make me feel safer. But the messages didn't stop. Nice parking job. Look behind you. I turned around so fast my vision blurred, but there was no one there. Just people walking by, oblivious. I grabbed my phone and rushed into the nearest store, my hands shaking as I dialed the number for the police. When they arrived, I showed them the messages, explained what had happened. They took a report, but they didn't seem too concerned. They told me it was probably some prank, maybe someone from the town trying to scare me. They offered to trace the number, but I could tell they didn't think it would lead anywhere. I changed my number after that, bought a new phone, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I get in my car, I think about that mechanic, about how my car never moved, about how he knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I still don't know who sent the messages, or why, but I've never gone back to that town. And I never will. I was just passing through this small town on a weekend trip. I had some time to kill and spotted a little bookshop tucked between two old buildings. It had one of those withered signs swinging over the door, Townsend's Books, and the front window was crowded with dusty stacks of books and faded posters. It looked like the kind of place where you might find something interesting, a hidden gem or an old classic you'd forgotten about. So, I went in, figuring I'd browse for a bit and maybe pick something up to read. Inside, it was dim, and it smelled like old paper and damp wood. The shelves were crammed close together, and there didn't seem to be much order to how things were arranged. There were books stacked sideways, some leaning against each other, and a couple that looked like they'd been shoved back in a hurry. It was quiet too, so quiet that I could hear my own footsteps on the creaky floorboards. I didn't see anyone behind the counter when I walked in, but a little bell over the door had jingled, so I figured someone must have noticed I'd come in. I started wandering through the aisles, looking at the spines of the books. Most of them didn't have any kind of organization, and some didn't even have titles on them, just blank covers. It was a bit strange, but I was curious, so I kept browsing. I must have been walking around for a good 10 minutes or so before I spotted a section in the very back, tucked away behind a tall shelf that seemed like it was almost meant to hide it. There was a handwritten sign over it that said "Private Collection." It wasn't big, just a small area with a few shelves and a narrow table. The books here were different. Some looked really old, with cracked leather covers and yellowed pages, but what caught my eye were these thin little booklets, almost like journals. They didn't have any titles on them, just scrawled writing on the front. I picked one up and flipped it open. The pages inside weren't printed, they were handwritten. The writing was messy and shaky, and it wasn't really stories or poems. It was more like thoughts or ramblings. A few sentences on one page would be about someone following the writer, then the next page would be about seeing strange shadows in the woods outside town. The more I read, the more it felt like the person who wrote it wasn't right in the head. I put it back and picked up another one. This one had more notes like that, except these talked about people in the town, describing them in weird ways, saying they were watchers or keepers. I didn't know what any of it meant, but it made my skin crawl, like I'd stumbled on something I wasn't supposed to see. Just then, I heard a floorboard creak behind me, and I turned around to see the shopkeeper standing there. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 60s, with white hair and a mustache that hung down past his lip. He had this thin frame, and his clothes looked old-fashioned, like he hadn't updated his wardrobe in decades. But the way he was looking at me, it was the way his eyes didn't blink, didn't move away. They were fixed on me in a way that made me feel pinned in place. "Find something interesting?" he asked. His voice was calm, too calm. I fumbled to put the little booklet back on the shelf and shook my head. "No, just browsing," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shakier than I meant it to. He took a step closer, and his eyes flicked to the booklets, then back to me. "Not many people go back there," he said. "That section's meant for the locals." "I didn't know," I said, starting to back away. "I was just curious." "Curiosity brought you here," he replied, taking another step. "Now you're part of it." I didn't like the way he said that, like there was some kind of hidden meaning behind the words. I took another step back, but he moved quicker than I thought an old man could, stepping right in front of me and blocking the way out of the little section. His thin frame didn't look like much, but there was something in his stance, the way he squared his shoulders, that told me I wasn't going to just push past him. "I should be going," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't mean to." "You don't leave, not now," he interrupted, his voice dropping lower. "You've read what's in there. You're part of the community now." I didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I took a step back and tried to move to the side, but he reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in harder than I thought he'd be able to. "Let go," I said, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. I felt a surge of panic then, like cold water pouring over me. The way he was holding onto me, it wasn't just a grip to keep me from moving, it felt like he was trying to drag me somewhere. "I'll call the police," I said, louder this time, hoping to scare him off. "Just let me go." He didn't let go, but I saw a flicker in his eyes, like something had shifted in him. His lips curled into a smile, and he said, "No need for that. You won't be needing a phone where you're going." That was it. I yanked my arm back as hard as I could and managed to break free from his grip. I didn't look back, I just ran straight for the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and every step I took felt like it took a year to get me closer to the exit. I expected him to come after me, to grab me from behind and pull me back into that dark corner, but when I reached the door and shoved it open, he was still standing there, just watching me with that same smile. I sprinted to my car, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. My hands were shaking so much it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition, and the whole time I kept looking back at the shop. He was still standing there, just inside the door, watching me with that same blank stare. I finally got the car started and pulled out of the lot so fast I nearly ran off the road. I didn't stop driving until I was at least a few towns over. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd somehow followed me, or that he'd put something on my car, but when I finally pulled over at a rest stop and got out to check, there was nothing. Just me, my car, and the empty road behind me. I don't know what that place was, or what he meant by community. I don't know if the things in those booklets were real or just the ramblings of someone unwell. But the way he looked at me, the way he said I was part of it now, it was like he was convinced that I'd crossed some kind of line, and there was no going back. I haven't been able to get the image of his face out of my head, or the feeling of his hand gripping my arm like he'd never let go. I don't know what he was planning to do, but I'm sure of one thing: I'm never setting foot in that town again. If you ever find yourself passing through, don't stop. Just keep driving. I didn't want to stop, not at first. I was passing through this small town, just trying to get back home. I had a project I wanted to get started on before the weekend was over, replacing some old flooring in the guest room, and I was missing a few things. Nails, some wood glue, and a new utility knife. Simple stuff. But when I saw the hardware store sign off the main road, I figured it wouldn't hurt to stop. The place didn't look like much, just a small, rundown building with a weathered sign that said Smith's Hardware in faded letters. There were a few pickup trucks parked outside, and one of those plastic open signs hanging crooked in the window. I parked my car and went inside, figuring I'd be in and out in a few minutes. The moment I walked in, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, and I glanced around. The shelves were packed tight with tools, screws, and all sorts of stuff, but everything felt off. The lights were dim, and there was this faint smell, like old wood and something metallic. There was a man behind the counter, maybe in his late 50s. He had thinning hair and wore a stained apron that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His eyes snapped up as soon as I walked in, like he had been waiting for me. He didn't say anything right away, just watched me as I wandered down one of the aisles. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. I found what I needed pretty quickly: a pack of nails, some wood glue, and a decent-looking utility knife, and headed toward the register. As I approached the counter, the man finally spoke. "You working on something?" His voice was raspy, like he'd been smoking too much, but there was something in his tone that rubbed me the wrong way. Too eager, maybe. "Yeah," I said, setting the items down. "Just replacing some flooring at home." He nodded slowly, like he was considering something. "That old knife you got there, it won't last long. You're better off with a heavier one, something that'll cut through the tougher stuff." I glanced at the knife. It looked fine to me. This should work for what I need. He stared at me for a second too long, then gave a slow smile. "Well, suit yourself. Just don't come back complaining when it breaks on you." I didn't respond, just waited while he rang up my things. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, like he was sizing me up, like he knew something I didn't. It made my skin crawl. "That'll be $22.50, he said, finally looking away. I handed him the cash, and as he gave me my change, he spoke again. "You doing the work yourself?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, keeping my answer short. I didn't feel like getting into a conversation with this guy. He nodded again, like he approved. "I could come by, give you a hand if you need it." I laughed, thinking he was just making small talk. "No, thanks. I've got it covered." But he didn't laugh. His smile stayed, but it was wrong, like it didn't belong on his face. "No trouble at all. I know my way around this kind of stuff. Been doing it for years. You'd be surprised how many folks think they can handle it, but it turns out they can't. I could save you some time. I shook my head, trying to be polite but firm. Really, I'm fine. I'm just doing a small job. He didn't seem to hear me. Where's your place? Just outside of town? I could swing by tonight, get it done quicker. That's when I started to feel really uneasy. He wasn't just being friendly. There was something else going on here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His insistence, the way he kept leaning forward, as if he was trying to pull me into something. I appreciate the offer, I said, taking a step back from the counter, but I'm good. I grabbed my bag of supplies and started to head for the door. But just as I reached it, I heard him call after me. You sure? I'm happy to help. I could follow you back right now. I turned, my hand on the doorknob, and gave him a final look. I'm sure. Thanks anyway. I didn't wait for him to respond. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the fading daylight. As I walked to my car, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting him to be standing in the doorway, watching me. But the door was closed, and the parking lot was empty, save for the 2 trucks. I got into my car, tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. I couldn't shake the weird feeling in my gut. It wasn't just that the guy was being pushy. There was something more to it, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to slip up somehow. I pulled out of the lot and got back on the main road, heading toward home. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. It was just a weird interaction. Small towns were full of weird people, right? But as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those trucks following me. And then I did. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. There were plenty of trucks in this part of the country. But as I kept driving, I noticed it stayed with me, hanging back just far enough to not seem obvious, but never too far behind. My chest tightened, and I felt my palms start to sweat. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just someone heading in the same direction. But I didn't like it. Not one bit. I decided to test it. I turned off onto a side road that I knew led to a dead end. If the truck followed me down there, then I'd know for sure. Sure enough, it did. I felt a cold knot in my stomach as I watched the truck in the mirror. It was the same one I'd seen parked outside the hardware store. There was no mistaking it. I kept driving down the narrow road, trying to stay calm. I told myself that I just needed to get to the end, turn around, and drive past him. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd just keep going. But as I approached the dead end, the truck sped up, closing the distance between us. My heart was racing now. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I wasn't going to find out by sticking around. I pulled to the side of the road and threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed up as fast as I could. The truck kept coming, getting closer and closer until it was just a few feet away. I floored the gas, spinning the car around and speeding back toward the main road. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was following me again. I just kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Eventually, I made it back to the highway. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that town, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what that guy wanted, or why he was so insistent on following me home. But I'm glad I didn't find out. Something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it felt like he had other plans. I never took that exit again, and I never went back to that hardware store. And now, whenever I need supplies for a project, I make sure to stop at a big chain store, somewhere crowded, somewhere safe. I decided to take a trip to Cuyahoga Valley National Park last summer. I needed some time away from everything, some solitude. I loved hiking, and the trails were beautiful. I parked my car at the entrance and picked a secluded trail that I thought would take me deep into the woods. The sun was bright, and the sounds of the forest were calming. I felt a sense of freedom as I walked, the smell of pine filling the air. After a few hours, I took a break. I found a nice spot by a small creek. I sat on a rock, dipped my hands in the cool water, and took a sip from my water bottle. As I relaxed, I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up, and my heart skipped a beat. It was Josh, my old friend from high school. I had not seen him in years. "Hey," he called, a broad smile on his face as he came closer. "Josh, is that you?" I asked, shocked. I could hardly believe it. We had lost touch after graduation, and I had no idea he was in the area. "Yeah, it's me." "I can't believe it." "What are you doing here?" he replied, looking as excited as I felt. We hugged, and I noticed he seemed different. His clothes were worn, and his beard was long and unkempt. There was a wild look in his eyes that made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside. "I just wanted to escape for a bit," I said. "I needed to get away from everything." "Same here," he said. "I have been living in the park for weeks. It is amazing out here. You wouldn't believe how beautiful it is if you stick to the main trails. Come with me. I can show you the real beauty of this place." I hesitated. There was something about the way he said it that sent a chill down my spine. But I remembered our old friendship and how adventurous we used to be. "Sure, why not?" I replied. As we walked, he talked about his life in the park. He claimed he had been sleeping under the stars and living off the land. I listened, but I started to notice his behavior becoming a bit odd. He spoke in a hurried tone, and there was a wildness in his gestures. He pointed out every bird and every rustle in the bushes as if it all held some great significance. "Look," he said suddenly, stopping dead in his tracks. He pointed to a tree, excitement glowing in his eyes. "This is a perfect spot. The view is incredible from here. You can see the valley stretching for miles." I looked around. It was nice, but it didn't seem special. It was just another spot in the woods. "It's beautiful," I said, trying to match his enthusiasm. "Not just beautiful. It is alive," he insisted, his voice rising. "You can feel the pulse of the earth here. You just have to know how to listen." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Right. I guess I'm just not tuned in yet." He stared at me, his expression suddenly serious. "You don't get it. You need to open your mind. You can't just walk the trails like everyone else." The air shifted, and I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. "Okay, Josh. Show me what you mean." He smiled, and for a moment, it felt like we were back to being old friends again. But as we continued walking, he kept glancing at me, studying me in a way that made me uneasy. We reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a small pond. The sunlight glistened on the water, and I felt a momentary sense of peace. I was ready to sit and enjoy the view, but Josh had other ideas. "This is where I come to think," he said, his voice low. "You should swim. Feel the connection." "I don't know. It's a bit cold," I replied, looking at the water. "Come on. You have to dive in," he urged, almost pleading. I stood there, the urge to leave gnawing at me. "Maybe later," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Josh's expression changed. "You don't trust me." It was a statement, not a question. "No, It's not that, I said quickly. I just what? He interrupted, stepping closer, his voice rising again. You think I'm crazy, don't you? That I'm just some wild man living in the woods? No, that's not it. I raised my hands defensively. I'm just surprised to see you, that's all. His face softened for a moment, but it quickly turned back to anger. You don't get it. You need to see. You need to understand. I backed away slowly, the discomfort transforming into genuine fear. Josh, I think I need to head back. Back? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to go back to that life? You can't go back. Why not? I asked, my voice trembling. He took a step towards me, his eyes wide and desperate. Because you are missing it. You don't see how beautiful it is here. The more he spoke, the more erratic his behavior became. He started pacing, talking to himself as if I was not even there. I was standing by the pond, my heart racing, feeling trapped. Josh, this isn't like you, I said, trying to reach him. We used to enjoy things together. Remember? He stopped pacing and stared at me, his expression shifting again. You don't understand the freedom. The beauty. You will never know if you go back. I need to go back, I said firmly, trying to sound brave. He lunged forward suddenly, grabbing my arm tightly. You can't leave. I need you to see. Panic surged through me, and I pulled away, breaking free from his grasp. Josh, let go of me. He hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. For a moment, I thought he might come back to reality. But then he stepped closer, eyes wild again. You are too far gone. I have to show you. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the ground, adrenaline pushing me forward as I dashed through the trees, branches slapping against me. I didn't look back, but I could hear him behind me, calling my name, his voice echoing in the silence of the forest. I sprinted down the path, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. I could hear him crashing through the brush behind me. I knew I had to keep moving. I felt the panic rising in my chest, but I refused to let it stop me. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted the trailhead ahead. I burst through the trees and onto the dirt path leading to my car. I could still hear him behind me, but I didn't stop to look. I fumbled for my keys, finally finding them in my pocket, and unlocked the door. I jumped inside, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding in my ears. I glanced out the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw him emerge from the trees, standing at the edge of the trail, watching me. His expression was a mix of anger and sadness, and I felt a twist of guilt. But I couldn't stay. I started the engine and drove away, my hands shaking on the wheel. As I left the park, I felt the weight of what had just happened settle on my shoulders. I had lost a friend that day, and I could only hope he would find his way back to himself. I drove for hours, the sun setting behind me, casting long shadows on the road. I knew I had to be more careful, to trust my instincts more than I ever had before. The wilderness was not just a place of beauty, it could also hide darkness that could consume a person. I had been working the night shift at a 24-hour laundromat for about 6 months. It was a simple job, really, just me and the machines humming softly in the dark. I liked the quiet hours, the rhythm of the washers and dryers, and the way the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. Most nights were uneventful, with just the occasional customer popping in. But there was one man who changed everything. He first walked in one Tuesday night, just as I was finishing up my shift. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, and had this odd way of moving, like he was gliding more than walking. He went straight to the back, where the industrial washers were, and sat down in one of the plastic chairs. At first, I thought he was waiting for a load of laundry. But he didn't bring in any clothes. Instead, he just sat there, staring at me. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the tasks I had to finish. I wiped down the counters, cleaned the lint traps, and kept glancing in his direction. He was still there, his eyes fixed on me, and it felt uncomfortable, like I was under a microscope. I could not shake off the feeling that he was watching my every move. When I finished my work and went to close up for the night, he was still there, just sitting quietly. The next night, he returned. Again, no laundry, just him sitting in the same spot, watching me. It was strange how he came back night after night without ever doing anything. I thought about calling the police, but he hadn't done anything wrong. Just sitting there, it felt like a violation, but I had no right to confront him. As the days passed, I noticed he had a routine. He always arrived around the same time, usually just after midnight, and left before I finished closing. It became a pattern, and I started to dread the moment the door would chime as he entered. He didn't speak, and I didn't ask. I just kept working, trying to convince myself he was harmless. But his presence made the air feel heavy, like I was trapped in some twisted version of my life. One night, I decided I could not take it anymore. I was scrubbing down the machines when I felt his eyes on me again, heavy and insistent. I put down my cloth and walked over to him. The fluorescent lights flickered as I approached, casting a sickly glow on his face. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound calm. "You can't just sit here without doing laundry. I need to ask you to leave." He looked up at me, his expression blank. Then he smiled, and that smile sent a chill through my spine. "I know where you live," he said simply, his voice smooth and quiet. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your address," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "I know it very well." Panic surged through me. "How do you know that?" I demanded, my heart racing. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. He didn't answer right away. He just continued to look at me, that same unnerving smile never leaving his face. I could hear the hum of the machines behind me, louder now, drowning out my thoughts. I wanted to scream for help, but there was no one around. "You live in that little house on Maple Street," he said, his tone casual. "The one with the blue shutters. You have a cat, right? A gray one. I see it sometimes when you come home from work." My breath caught in my throat. The way he spoke, so calmly, as if this was a normal conversation, made my skin crawl. I had never mentioned my cat or my address to anyone at work. I felt exposed, like I was standing in front of him completely naked. "Please," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "You need to leave. This isn't okay." He tilted his head, still smiling. "I just like to watch you. You work hard. It is fascinating." "Fascinating?" I echoed, incredulous. I took a step back, wanting to put distance between us. "That is creepy. You cannot just sit here and watch me work every night. It is not normal." "Normal is a matter of perspective," he replied, leaning forward slightly. "You should be careful. There are worse people than me out there." I turned to leave, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. I reached for the phone on the counter, my hands shaking. "I will call the police if you do not leave." "Go ahead," he said, unfazed. "I'll be here when you get back." I hurried to the back office, my heart pounding, and dialed 911. I explained the situation, my voice shaky as I tried to describe the man. They told me they would send someone, but it would take time. I didn't know if I could stay there alone until they arrived. I took a deep breath and decided I couldn't wait. I needed to get out. I glanced back at the man, who was still sitting there, still watching me, and I felt a rush of anger and fear. I grabbed my things, ready to leave, when I heard the door chime again. The man's eyes shifted to the entrance, and I turned as well. Another customer had come in, a young woman, probably in her 20s. She looked surprised to see me in such a panic, and I quickly waved to her. "I need to go. Can you please stay with him until the police arrive?" She nodded, looking concerned, and I dashed out the back door, my heart racing as I stepped into the cool night air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, desperate to lock the door behind me. I could still feel his eyes on me, the memory of that smile haunting me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the laundromat door, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Just the darkened windows of the laundromat and the night stretching out in front of me. The police called later that night to tell me they had found the man, but he had given them a false name and disappeared before they could get any real information. I never returned to that laundromat. I quit my job the next day, taking a position at a place with daytime hours. I thought about him often, that smile and those unsettling words. I never learned who he really was or why he had chosen to fixate on me. But I took every precaution when I got home, double-checking the locks and peering out the windows before settling in for the night. The memory of his voice still lingered, a reminder that sometimes the darkest things are not found in shadows or nightmares, but in the very real world around us. The night shift at the front desk was usually uneventful. It was a small hotel, just a handful of guests at any given time, and the lobby was empty most of the night. I'd sit at the desk, sometimes doing nothing but scrolling on my phone or reading a book to pass the time. It wasn't the kind of job that kept you on your toes. It was quiet, still. Nothing ever happened. Then, one night, I got a call around 2:30 in the morning. I remember the time exactly because I just looked at the clock, counting the hours left in my shift. The phone ringing in the dead silence of the lobby made me jump a little. I picked it up, doing my best to sound alert and professional. "Front desk, how can I help you?" There was a pause on the other end. I thought maybe it was one of the guests needing something, but all I heard was breathing. After a few seconds, I was about to hang up, assuming it was a prank, when a man's voice came on. It was low, calm, almost too calm. "I see you're reading." I froze, my heart skipping. I'd been holding my book in my lap, just flipping through pages without really paying attention. It was a small habit, something I did to stay awake. I looked around the empty lobby, wondering if maybe it was one of the guests playing a joke. But the voice, I didn't recognize it. I glanced at the monitors by the desk. There were security cameras covering most of the main areas, including the lobby, but I didn't see anyone. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound firm. The line went quiet again for a moment, then he spoke. "I'm just here. Watching." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. My skin felt prickly, like I was being watched from somewhere just out of sight. I checked the cameras again, but the lobby was empty, and all the other feeds were showing empty hallways and closed doors. I told myself it was a prank, probably one of the guests who'd seen me from a window or something. Maybe they just wanted to mess with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. I'm calling security. No, you're not, the voice said, almost in a whisper. You're just going to keep standing there. Because you know I'm close. You know I can see you. I swallowed hard, a cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I looked around again, every corner of the lobby. There was nothing, nobody, just the stillness of the night. I picked up the phone again, this time to call my manager or security, but as soon as I lifted it, the line went dead. Silence. I tried pressing some buttons, but the phone wasn't responding. It was like it had just shut down. Don't ignore me. The voice was in the room, almost as if it was right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I was imagining things or if someone was really there, just out of sight. I moved to the back office, where there was another phone line, hoping this one would work, but as soon as I touched the receiver, the lights in the lobby flickered, then dimmed. "Why are you hiding?" he said, his voice filling the quiet. "I can see you." I bolted out of the office, half expecting to see someone standing in the lobby, but it was empty. My legs felt shaky as I walked back to the front desk. The cameras were still on, all the screens showing empty hallways, empty rooms, nothing out of the ordinary. But it didn't make sense. I could feel him watching me, somewhere close. I grabbed my phone, about to call 911, but then my screen lit up with an unknown number. It was a text. "You don't need to call for help," it read. "I'm right here with you." I dropped the phone, my heart racing. I didn't even pick it up. I just stared at it, like it would start ringing again at any moment. And then it did. The same number. I couldn't ignore it this time. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and put it to my ear without saying anything. "You're looking a little scared," he said, his voice softer, almost mocking. "You don't have to be scared, you know. I'm just here to talk." My voice came up barely a whisper. "Who are you?" He chuckled, low and quiet. "I'm someone who knows you. Someone who's been watching you for a while now. You're very interesting." My breath was coming in short gasps now. "What do you want?" "Oh, nothing much," he said. "Just to see you." I looked at the cameras again, scanning each one carefully, looking for any sign of movement. But everything was still, as if the whole hotel was holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. I was too afraid to leave, but staying felt even worse. I decided to go into the back office again, lock the door, call the police, anything to get away from the open space of the lobby. As I moved, I could hear his voice again, this time from the speaker system. "Running away? That's not very nice." I froze. The speaker system in the lobby was playing his voice. I looked up at the small speaker mounted on the wall, feeling like his eyes were right there, watching me from some hidden place. "Don't leave, please," he said, his tone dripping with something that felt almost like sadness. "I just want to see you one last time." I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing down the hall as I dashed into the back office, slamming the door shut. I locked it and leaned against it, my whole body shaking. The phone on the desk was blinking, another incoming call. I couldn't bring myself to answer, but the ringing wouldn't stop. It just kept going, that endless sound filling the small room. I picked it up, hands trembling, and held it to my ear. "I told you, you can't hide." I dropped the phone again, backing away until I was pressed against the wall. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I felt trapped. He knew everything I was doing, every step I took. I grabbed my phone again, my fingers fumbling as I tried to text my manager, but before I could even type a single word, another text came through. "Open the door." I stared at the message, my hands cold. "Open the door," it said again, like he knew exactly where I was, what I was doing. "No," I whispered to myself, clutching my phone, trying to think of something, anything I could do to get out of this. I typed out a quick text to my manager, asking for help, telling him someone was in the building, but as soon as I hit send, my phone went dark. Then I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps outside the office door. The sound of someone moving, pausing, then moving again. I covered my mouth to keep from making any noise, pressing myself back against the wall, hoping he'd just leave, hoping he'd go away. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and I could hear him breathing, the same low, steady breathing I'd heard on the phone. "I know you're in there," he whispered. "Come on out." I'm waiting. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just kept my eyes on the door, waiting for it to burst open. But after a few seconds, the breathing stopped. Silence. I waited, straining my ears, but I didn't hear anything. Minutes passed, and still nothing. I reached for the phone on the desk, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The line connected, and I barely managed to whisper, "There's someone in the building. He's been watching me. Please send someone." The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, told me to stay put, stay quiet. I hung up, the phone slipping from my hand as I slumped against the wall, waiting, listening. Every sound felt magnified, every creak of the floor, every small rustle of paper. I felt trapped, caught in this nightmare that didn't seem real. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the distant sound of sirens. I stayed put until I heard the heavy footsteps of the police outside the door, calling my name. They found me there, shaking, barely able to explain what had happened. They searched the building but found nothing. No one had seen a man come or go, and all the cameras showed was me, alone, moving around the lobby, talking on the phone. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next time I let my guard down. I was working on a photography project, places of worship around the city, mostly older buildings with that heavy, almost eerie history to them. I liked the silence, the emptiness. There's a strange calm to those places at night when they're supposed to be empty. I'd managed to get permission to photograph this old church that had been closed down for years. It was in rough shape, dust thick on everything, the smell of damp settling in every corner. Perfect for what I wanted. I got there around midnight, set up my tripod near the altar, and started shooting. The only sounds were the faint clicks of my camera and the occasional creak of wood settling. The place was dark except for the dim light filtering in from a street lamp outside and the small flashlight I had with me. It was cold too, my breath came out in visible puffs. After about an hour of shooting, I started noticing faint noises. It wasn't much at first. Just a light tap here, a shuffle there, like an animal scurrying around in the dark corners. I told myself it was probably a rat or some bird trapped inside. The building had a few broken windows, so it wasn't unlikely. I kept working, but the sound didn't stop. It got louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from somewhere toward the back of the church. I froze, hoping maybe it was just the building shifting or something. But the steps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. It sounded like slow, careful pacing, like they were waiting for something. I was alone. I'd locked the door when I came in, so I didn't understand how anyone else could be there. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and turned around. My flashlight beam swung through the darkness, but there was nothing there. just empty pews and shadows, stretching all the way to the back wall. I tried to calm myself down, but the footsteps picked up again, closer this time, and more insistent. They stopped a few feet behind me, and that's when I heard someone clear their throat. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to turn around, expecting. I don't know what, but definitely not what I saw. A man stood there, dressed in old, faded clothes that looked like they belonged in another decade. His face was blank, just staring at me. The thing that struck me the most was how still he was. He didn't move, didn't even blink. He was just standing there, watching. "Can I help you?" I managed to ask, my voice a lot shakier than I would have liked. "I'm the caretaker here," he said, in this flat, almost rehearsed tone. "You're here late. You shouldn't be." There was something strange in his voice, like he was forcing himself to sound normal but didn't quite know how. His face was expressionless, his eyes fixed on me with this intense focus that made my skin crawl. "I'm a photographer," I said, trying to sound calm. "I got permission to shoot here." The man didn't react. He just kept staring at me, his eyes unblinking. "They didn't tell me about that," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't be here. Not at this hour." I tried to reason with him, saying I had the paperwork and everything, but he didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he took a slow step forward. It wasn't much, just a tiny shift, but it was enough to make my heart race. Who gave you permission?" he asked, his voice so quiet I barely heard it. I was starting to feel uneasy. Something about this man wasn't right. He was too calm, too still. I told him the name of the person who'd arranged the access, hoping it would satisfy him, but he didn't even blink. "They didn't tell me," he repeated, his voice a bit louder now, like he was talking more to himself than to me. The whole situation felt off. I glanced at my gear, wondering if I should just pack up and go. I didn't want to make this guy mad, but there was something unsettling about him. Something that made me want to get out of there as fast as possible. The man stepped closer again, his face still blank, eyes never leaving me. "It's not safe here," he murmured, almost like a warning. "Not for you." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll just finish up and leave, okay?" He shook his head slowly, that strange, empty expression never changing. "You won't leave," he said, almost to himself. "Not yet." Something in his tone chilled me to the bone. He sounded so sure, like he knew something I didn't, something he wasn't telling me. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I started to pack up my camera, keeping one eye on him. The whole time, he just stood there, watching, his face a blank mask. When I was done, I grabbed my bag and turned to head toward the door. But he moved to block my path, quick and silent, like he'd been waiting for that moment. His face was close to mine now, close enough that I could see the dark shadows under his eyes, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "You're not leaving," he said, and this time there was a hint of something in his voice, almost excitement. I took a step back, feeling the panic start to build. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from him. "Listen, man," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'll just head out. No need for this." He smiled then, this slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're here," he said, like it explained everything, like that was all he needed to keep me there. I tried to sidestep him, but he moved with me, blocking my way again. My pulse was racing now, my hands starting to sweat. I could feel that sense of dread growing, the realization that I might not get out of there as easily as I thought. "Why won't you let me leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his expression changed. There was something dark in his gaze, something that made my stomach twist. "It's not your time," he murmured, almost as if he was talking to himself. Then he turned, walked a few steps back into the darkness, and disappeared. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. The second he was out of sight, I bolted for the door, practically running down the aisle and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When I finally looked back at the church, the man was standing in the doorway, just watching me. His expression was calm, almost amused, like he'd expected me to run. He didn't move, didn't try to follow me, but I could feel his eyes on me even as I drove away. I don't know what he wanted or why he was there. All I know is that I won't be going back to that church again. Whatever was wrong with him, whatever his reason for keeping me there, it was something I don't ever want to understand. It was late, and I was exhausted. I had been driving for hours, on my way to visit family, and I was just over halfway through my trip. The highway stretched on for miles, and I could feel my eyelids getting heavier as I drove. I hadn't planned on stopping, but the tiredness hit me harder than I expected, so I pulled off at the next rest area. It wasn't much, just a small lot with a few scattered cars. There was a dim light by the bathroom, and the rest of the area was dark and quiet, save for a few distant trucks parked along the far end. I didn't think twice about it. I figured I'd just take a quick break, stretch my legs, maybe rest my eyes for a few minutes. I parked near the edge, where there weren't many cars. It felt safer that way, more isolated. I locked the doors and reclined the seat back a bit. It was comfortable enough for a quick nap, but I kept the engine running. The last thing I wanted was to wake up to a dead battery after trying to rest. I hadn't been in the car for more than 20 minutes when I heard the tap on my window. At first, I thought it was just someone walking past, but the tap came again, louder this time, a little insistent. I sat up straight, suddenly alert. I didn't expect anyone to be around, especially not in the middle of the night. I turned my head, and there was a man standing outside my window, his face barely visible in the dark. He was wearing a uniform, but not the kind I expected. He had a badge clipped to his shirt, which looked like some kind of police badge. But something about it didn't sit right. It was too shiny, too new-looking. "Ma'am," he said, tapping on the glass again, his voice muffled by the window, "I need you to roll down the window." I didn't move at first. The whole situation felt strange. It was late, there was barely anyone around, and I had never seen a cop like him before. The uniform seemed off too. The stitching wasn't right, and I could see the badge wasn't sewn the way it should be. It just didn't look real. I didn't even want to think about why someone would be pretending to be a cop in the middle of nowhere at that hour. I didn't open the window. Instead, I just looked at him through the glass. He stood there for a moment, almost like he was expecting me to comply. When I didn't move, he said, "I'm Officer Wilson. You've been parked here for a while. Just making sure everything's okay." I didn't recognize his name, but then again, I wasn't familiar with this area at all. I still didn't trust him, so I didn't say anything. I just sat there, watching him. He tried again. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions." "Roll down the window." I looked at him a bit longer, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't sure if he was legitimate or if something wasn't right. A real officer wouldn't approach someone like this. They wouldn't tap on a window in the middle of the night and try to get me to open up when I was clearly in the middle of resting. I decided to speak up, my voice shaky but firm. I'm not comfortable rolling down the window. What do you need? He hesitated for a moment, like he wasn't expecting me to question him. His eyes flicked to the side, and I could see him adjusting his stance a little, like he was preparing to say something else. I'm just checking in, he said, a little too casually. I've been making rounds, and I saw you parked here. You should be more careful, especially this time of night. Not many people stop here. You never know who's around. I felt my stomach tighten. His words didn't make sense. If he was truly a cop, he wouldn't be acting this way. He would have just asked to see my ID, maybe run a quick check on the car, but he was trying to make me feel like I was in danger, trying to intimidate me into rolling the window down. No, thank you, I replied. I'm fine. I'm just resting. I'm not bothering anyone. I could see him look at me with a slight frown. He didn't like my refusal, and I could tell that he was adjusting his approach now. He shifted his weight again, taking a step back before leaning in closer to the window. You know, he said in a low voice, I could write you up for loitering here. It's against the rules to park after dark. It's unsafe for a woman to be here alone. His words made me tense up. I had no idea what the rules were in this rest area, but he was making things up now, trying to intimidate me further. His voice had dropped even lower, more threatening, and I could hear the sharpness in his tone. I felt a wave of dread hit me, and every instinct in my body told me to get out of there. I wasn't sure what his game was, but I knew one thing for certain. He was not a cop. There was no way someone in law enforcement would act like this. And no real officer would demand I open my window in the middle of nowhere, especially when there was nothing suspicious going on. The whole thing felt wrong. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at him, but I knew I had to get out. I wasn't going to roll down the window, and I wasn't going to let him get any closer. I decided that I needed to leave. Now! I started the car up without saying anything else. He looked taken aback, surprised that I wasn't going to engage any further. As I started to drive away, I saw him step back quickly, almost stumbling, his face now completely visible in the dim light. He wasn't wearing a police uniform after all. It was just a jacket that resembled one, but it wasn't real. I didn't catch his full face, but I could see enough of it to know he was trying to deceive me. There was something off about him. His face was pale, his eyes too wide, and his mouth twisted in an unnatural way. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I kept my foot on the gas, and I didn't stop until I found a gas station with bright lights and people milling about. I stayed there for a while, my heart still racing, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself it was over. I was safe now. That night changed everything. I always made sure to double-check everything before I trust someone who approaches me, especially at night. I learned the hard way to trust my instincts, and that feeling of something being off is never wrong. Even now, I can't help but think about that man, wondering how many others he's tried to pull this with. I had worked as a press operator for a little over 3 years. The job was simple enough. I handled the printing press at a small printing company. The nights were usually quiet, just me and the hum of the machines, with the occasional click of the fax machine in the corner. I preferred the night shifts. There was something comforting about the darkness outside, the feeling of being the only one awake when the world slept. One night, everything changed. It started when I noticed something odd on the printed sheets coming off the press. The designs were different, almost erratic. At first, I thought it was just a glitch in the system. The patterns looked like random symbols, jumbled together without any meaning. I set them aside, intending to fix the issue in the morning. As the night went on, I kept seeing those same sheets piling up. I tried to focus on my work, but my curiosity got the better of me. I flipped through the stack. The symbols began to form recognizable shapes, like letters. I squinted at them, trying to make sense of it all. There were letters that seemed to spell words, but they were mixed in with the symbols, and it was hard to read. Then, I noticed something chilling. Some of the phrases were oddly familiar. They were details about my life that I had never shared with anyone at work. The first one I caught read, "You hate Mondays." I blinked, trying to shake off the creeping unease that started to settle in my stomach. I had mentioned that once, casually, to a coworker during lunch, but it was not something I discussed regularly. I set the papers aside and tried to concentrate on my tasks. I rolled the ink and adjusted the settings on the press, but my mind kept drifting back to those strange prints. I pulled out the sheets again, flipping through them faster this time, searching for more of those words. My heart raced as I read, "You don't like the coffee here." That one stung. I had said it just last week, joking with the other press operators about how bad it was. Feeling unnerved, I took a break and stepped outside for some air. The night was still and quiet, the stars twinkling against the black sky. I tried to clear my head, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as I went back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around the shop, but everything seemed normal, the machines quietly humming. When I returned to my station, I found more sheets stacked up, the symbols now forming entire sentences. "You miss your family." My breath caught in my throat. I had not spoken about them in a long time, not even to my closest friends at work. I started to feel like I was in a twisted game where someone else knew too much about me. The unsettling feeling deepened. I looked around the shop again, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone, anyone who might be playing this sick prank. The dim light made everything feel shadowy and uncertain. I wanted to call out, to ask if someone was there, but fear kept me silent. Instead, I kept working, but my focus was shot. Each new sheet sent chills through me as they continued to reveal things I had never shared. "You can't sleep at night," read one. "You don't like the way your boss treats you," said another. I felt my heart pound against my rib cage. Then came the worst one of all. "You don't trust anyone at this company." That hit hard. I had kept my guard up ever since starting this job, and now someone was holding a mirror to my fears. I needed to figure out who was doing this. I decided to go into the storage area where we kept the extra paper and supplies. It was a little less brightly lit, but I felt like I could hide there if necessary. As I stepped inside, I could hear my heart racing, each beat echoing in the silence. In the dark corner of the storage room, I spotted a flickering light. A laptop was sitting on a crate, the screen illuminated. I hesitated for a moment, peering closer. That's when I saw someone sitting in the shadows, hunched over the keyboard. My gut twisted in knots. I thought I might just turn and run, but curiosity held me in place. I needed to know who this person was and how they knew so much about me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure turned, and in that moment, I recognized him. It was Jake, another press operator who had recently started working night shifts. We had exchanged a few words here and there, but nothing significant. He looked up at me, and his expression was hard to read. He didn't speak, but there was a slight smirk on his face that sent chills down my spine. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just working," he replied, his tone casual. "You should see what I've been creating. It's fascinating stuff." He gestured to the laptop, and I saw lines of code, strange symbols forming on the screen. I stepped closer, my heart pounding louder than ever. "Why are you writing about me?" How do you know all this stuff? I felt angry and scared at the same time. I wanted answers, but part of me was terrified of what those answers might be. He leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. It's easy. You leave your life open for anyone to see. I just pick up on the details. There was something sinister in his tone that made my skin crawl. I felt trapped, cornered by his presence. This isn't a joke. It's not funny, I said, trying to sound brave. But fear clawed at my insides. He stood up, his demeanor shifting. You think I'm playing a game? This is serious. You don't even know what I can do with this information. He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away, looking for an escape route. Stop, I said, my voice firm despite the trembling. You're crossing a line. You can't just invade someone's privacy like this. He paused, looking at me with a mix of amusement and irritation. You really should watch your back, he said, stepping closer again. You never know who's watching. I turned and ran out of the storage room, adrenaline flooding my body. I rushed back to my station, desperately trying to shake the feeling of his eyes on me. I needed to get out of there. I wanted to go home and never return. As I reached the main area of the printing shop, I could still hear the hum of the machines, but now it felt suffocating. I grabbed my things, not caring about the printed sheets anymore. I wanted to leave this nightmare behind. I could still feel Jake's presence lingering in the air, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was still watching me, even from a distance. I ran out into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a wave of relief. I drove home in a daze, heart racing, mind racing even faster. I decided I would talk to my boss in the morning. I would tell him everything. I needed to feel safe again. The next day, I went to work and had a conversation with my boss. I explained everything, from the strange symbols to Jake's unsettling behavior. He took my concerns seriously and assured me he would address the situation. They let Jake go that day. I never found out what his intentions were, but I felt a sense of relief as I left the building for the last time. The experience changed how I viewed the world. I learned to be cautious with what I shared, realizing that not everyone can be trusted. I decided to move on, leaving that place behind, but the memory of those printed symbols haunted me for a long time after. I had always been drawn to the outdoors. Hiking, camping, and being surrounded by nature was my escape from the busy life back home. When I finally got the chance to visit Great Basin National Park, I felt like I was stepping into paradise. The vastness of the night sky and the rugged mountains were mesmerizing. I planned a night hike, wanting to experience the park under the stars. The sun set slowly, and I started my hike just as twilight settled in. I had a flashlight strapped to my waist, and the beam of light flickered against the trees, illuminating my path. As I walked, the sounds of the night surrounded me, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of crickets, and the occasional call of an owl. It felt peaceful, almost magical, but something in the air felt heavy, as if the night was holding its breath. After hiking for about an hour, I reached a clearing with a view of the stars. I stopped to take it all in, the vastness of the universe stretching above me. I pulled out my phone to take a picture when I noticed a movement on one of the nearby rock outcroppings. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but there it was again, a figure, waving at me. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see more clearly. The figure was standing on the rock, silhouetted against the night sky. They raised their arm again, a slow and deliberate wave, as if they were beckoning me over. My heart raced with excitement and curiosity. I had heard that it was common for hikers to encounter other people out in the wilderness, especially on popular trails like this one. I assumed this person might have a similar interest in the stars or was simply enjoying the solitude of the night. "Hello!" I called out, raising my hand in response. "Is everything okay?" The figure continued to wave, but I noticed something odd. They were not moving from that spot. No steps were taken toward me. The way they waved felt almost mechanical, like they were waiting for me to approach. A chill ran down my spine. Despite the unease creeping in, I felt compelled to investigate. I started walking towards the outcropping, careful with each step. The ground was rocky and uneven, and I felt a mix of excitement and dread. As I got closer, I called out again, "Hey, are you all right?" The figure was now barely visible. The moment I stepped onto the outcropping, I realized there was no one there. I stood frozen, scanning the area for any sign of movement. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the thrill of the unknown turning into something darker. The air felt thicker, and I felt like I was being watched. Then I noticed the ground beneath me. The dirt was freshly disturbed, as if someone had been standing right there just moments before. There were footprints leading away from the rock, but they were erratic and scattered, like whoever had been there had moved quickly and in a panic. My breath quickened as I crouched down to examine the area more closely. The footprints were not from a hiker's boots. They were bare and left a clear imprint in the soil, leading deeper into the darkness. I glanced back at the path I had come from. It felt like a lifetime away, and the way back suddenly seemed daunting. I had always felt comfortable in nature, but now it felt like a trap. A cold wind swept through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I stood up, a deep sense of fear washing over me. I had to leave. I turned around, planning to retrace my steps, but I hesitated. I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. I quickly made my way back to the trail, glancing over my shoulder. The darkness felt alive, as if it were watching me. I moved faster, adrenaline pushing me forward, and I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just someone playing a prank or perhaps a hiker who had lost their way. But something deep inside me knew that this was different. The shadows around me felt longer, darker. I picked up my pace, my breathing coming in sharp bursts as I hurried down the trail. Every rustle of the leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. The more I hurried, the more the fear grew. I wanted to believe I was just overreacting, but it felt too real. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I glanced around, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the area was quiet. I threw my gear in the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. I sat there for a moment, heart racing, trying to calm myself. I looked back at the trail, the darkness swallowing it up, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. As I drove away, I could not shake the feeling that I had escaped something sinister. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had seen. The figure waving, the disturbed earth, and the footprints leading into the night haunted me as I left the park. I would never forget the feeling of being watched, the quiet tension of the night, and the strange, unsettling encounter that pushed me to the edge. Great Basin National Park was meant to be a refuge, a place of beauty, but it turned into a nightmare I would carry with me long after I left. I promised myself I would never hike alone at night again, knowing that the wilderness can hold more than just nature. It can hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace, just me, my tent, and the quiet of the woods. I had packed my gear the night before, excited for the chance to disconnect and enjoy nature. After a long drive, I found a secluded spot near a small lake, set up my camp, and built a fire. The sun had dipped behind the trees, leaving a crisp chill in the air. I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, and felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. That night, I roasted some marshmallows and listened to the crackling of the fire. I was tired but content. I finally crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and closed my eyes, allowing the soft sounds of the night to lull me to sleep. Hours later, I woke suddenly, not knowing why. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the tent. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I listened, and that's when I heard it, the soft crackle of the fire. I had not put more wood on it before going to sleep. Curiosity piqued, I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The fire flickered, casting long shadows in the night. As I scanned the area, I saw someone sitting by the fire. They were facing away from me, their silhouette outlined by the flames. My heart dropped. Who was that? I cleared my throat, trying to sound brave. Hello? The figure didn't move or respond. Just sat there, perfectly still. I hesitated, my heart racing. I took a deep breath, hoping it was just another camper who lost their way or something harmless. Excuse me, do you need help? Nothing. Just silence. I felt the cold creeping up my spine. There was something unsettling about the way they sat there, as if they were not a person at all but a statue. I took a cautious step out of my tent, the ground crunching beneath my feet. Hello? I tried again, my voice firmer this time. I stepped closer to the fire, hoping the light would chase away the creeping fear inside me. As I got nearer, I could see their outline more clearly. They wore dark clothes, and their hair hung down, partially obscuring their face. The flames flickered, casting strange shadows on their features. I took another step, and that's when they turned slowly to face me. I could not see their eyes, just a shadowy void where their face should be. It felt wrong, like looking at something I was not meant to see. My stomach churned, and every instinct told me to turn and run, but I stood frozen, my feet glued to the ground. What are you doing here? I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The figure just stared at me. I could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down, but still, they did not speak. It was like time had stopped. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the crackling of the fire almost drowned out by the sound of my breath. Suddenly, the figure stood up. I instinctively took a step back, my mind racing. Wait. I called out, not knowing what I hoped to achieve. They did not respond. Instead, they turned and began to walk into the darkness, away from the light of the fire. I watched in disbelief, unable to move. They moved silently, as if they were part of the night, blending into the shadows. Who are you? I shouted after them, panic rising in my throat. But they continued to walk, not glancing back, just disappearing into the trees. I felt a rush of fear as adrenaline coursed through my veins. I didn't think, just reacted. I ran after them, pushing through the brush, branches snapping underfoot. Hey! I yelled, desperate for an answer, desperate for anything. But they were gone. I stumbled to a stop, breathless and shaking, the darkness closing in around me. I turned back toward my camp, realizing how isolated I was out there. I could barely see the glow of my fire now. I hurried back, heart racing, feeling like I was being hunted. Once I reached the camp, I quickly grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever that had been there. But nothing. The woods were silent, too silent. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I felt the urge to pack up and leave right then, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I stood by the fire, the flames flickering wildly in the night air, creating a barrier of warmth and light around me. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but I could not shake the feeling of eyes upon me. After what felt like hours, I finally decided to stay awake, unwilling to let sleep claim me again. I sat there, my back against a tree, the fire crackling beside me. Every sound sent my heart racing, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The night dragged on, and I kept thinking about that figure. Who were they? What did they want? I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to understand what had happened. It was just a strange encounter, right? But my instinct screamed that it was something more. Finally, as dawn broke, I heard the birds starting to sing. The light began to filter through the trees, pushing back the darkness. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I decided I would pack up and leave, head back to my car and drive home. I began to gather my things, moving quickly. The sun was rising higher, and I felt safer with the light around me. As I packed, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see that figure again, but the woods were empty. I finished packing up my gear, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. As I started to walk back to my car, I took one last look at the campfire. The ashes were cold, and the smoke drifted lazily into the air. I turned to leave, ready to put the whole experience behind me. But as I walked away, I heard something. A voice, soft and distant, just above a whisper. "You should not have come here." I froze, my heart racing again. I looked back at the fire, but there was no one there. Just me in the empty woods. The chill returned, creeping down my spine, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I got in. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away, the woods shrinking in my rearview mirror. I had gone to the laundromat pretty late that night. It was the only time I could fit it in, and I liked it better when it was quiet. Most people were already home by then, so it was usually just me and a few empty machines. When I walked in, the place was almost empty, just one guy sitting on one of the plastic chairs by the dryers. I didn't think anything of him at first. He was kind of slouched in his seat, just staring off into space. I dumped my basket of clothes onto a folding table and started sorting them into the washing machine. I kept my head down, trying to get it done fast, but every time I looked up, I noticed the guy was still sitting there, not moving. His eyes were fixed on me. I didn't want to overreact, but there was something about the way he stared. It wasn't casual. It was like he didn't even blink. I ignored him and kept loading the washer. I figured he was just killing time while waiting for his clothes to dry. When I looked up again, though, he wasn't sitting in the chair anymore. I didn't hear him move, but now he was standing closer, just a couple of machines down from where I was. His head was tilted a little, and he had this strange half-smile on his face. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, "need to use this one?" I gestured to the washer I was using. He didn't answer, just kept staring at me with that same weird smile. I felt my skin start to crawl. It wasn't just that he was looking at me, it was how still he was, like he was waiting for something. I turned back to my laundry and finished loading the machine, then I put the quarters in and started it. I grabbed the rest of my clothes and headed over to the dryer on the other side of the room, trying to put some space between us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and I saw him go back to the chair and sit down again. But now he was watching me even more intently, his eyes following me wherever I moved. I decided to ignore him. Maybe he was just weird or lonely or something, and I was letting it get to me. I pulled my phone out and started scrolling, just to keep myself distracted while I waited. After a few minutes, I reached into my laundry basket to start folding some of the clean clothes I had taken out of the dryer earlier, but something wasn't right. There was a shirt missing. I knew I had put it in there, but it was gone. I looked up, and there he was again, standing right near the folding table, a little closer than before. That smile was still on his face. I tried to stay calm and asked him if he'd seen the shirt that had been in my basket. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head slowly, that smile not fading even a little. It was like he was amused by the whole thing. I was getting frustrated and a bit freaked out at this point, but I didn't want to start anything. I went back to folding the rest of my clothes, but I kept my eye on him this time. I didn't look away for more than a second. Every time I glanced back, he was still there, that same smile, that same look. A few minutes passed, and I noticed another piece of clothing was gone. This time, it was one of my socks. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't like the sock could have just fallen out of the basket without me noticing. It felt like he was messing with me on purpose, but I hadn't seen him move. I looked at him directly, and I could see the look in his eyes change slightly, like he was daring me to say something. I finally confronted him. "Are you taking my stuff?" I asked, louder than I'd meant to. My voice echoed a little in the empty laundromat. He didn't flinch or look away. He just stood there, staring at me with that creepy smile. "I didn't touch your clothes," he said in a voice that was almost too calm, like he was used to lying or something. "You must have misplaced them." I knew he was lying. There was no one else in the place, and I had been right there the whole time. I stepped closer to him, trying to see if he had anything in his hands or his pockets, but he just kept smiling, like he was in on some joke that I wasn't. "Check your basket again," he said, his voice still calm but with a hint of something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned back to my basket and started digging through it, looking for the missing shirt and sock. I knew they wouldn't be there, but I didn't know what else to do. When I looked up, he had moved closer again. He was standing right at the edge of the folding table now, barely a foot away from me. His smile widened, and I saw something in his eyes, like a flicker of excitement. It was like he was enjoying watching me get worked up. I stepped back, trying to put some distance between us. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I also didn't want to stay in that place any longer. I grabbed what was left of my laundry and shoved it into the basket. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can keep whatever you took." He didn't say anything, just kept watching me as I headed toward the door. I could feel his eyes on my back, and I half expected him to grab me or try to stop me, but he didn't. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold night air. As I walked away, I glanced back through the glass window of the laundromat. He was still standing there, in the same spot, that smile frozen on his face, like he hadn't moved at all. He didn't follow me out. He didn't even watch me leave. It was like he was satisfied with whatever game he had been playing. When I got home, I went through my laundry again, and just like I thought, the shirt and sock were still missing. I don't know what he did with them or why he took them. I didn't go back to that laundromat after that, and I made sure to start doing my laundry during the day, even if it was crowded. I keep thinking about the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for me to figure something out, like he knew something I didn't. I don't know what he was after, but the way he smiled, it felt like he was telling me I'd never really be able to understand it, even if I wanted to. I'm just glad I left when I did. I moved into that apartment about a year ago. It was nothing fancy, just a basic one-bedroom place in an old building. The rent was cheap, and the neighborhood was decent, so I didn't have much to complain about. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, and I liked that. I wasn't the type to make small talk with neighbors, and I appreciated that no one tried to make it. The knocking started maybe 2 months after I settled in. It wasn't constant at first, just here and there. The first time I heard it, it was around 2 in the morning. I remember waking up to this faint, rhythmic knock. It wasn't loud, more like someone gently tapping their knuckles on the door. I was groggy and disoriented, so I didn't think much of it. I figured someone had the wrong apartment. It stopped after a minute or two, and I went back to sleep. But it kept happening. Every few nights, always around the same time, middle of the night, when everything was quiet. The knocking would start, soft at first, then a little louder, like whoever was on the other side was getting impatient. I started to get annoyed, thinking maybe it was some drunk coming home late, confused about which apartment was theirs. I never got out of bed to check. I'd just lie there, listening, waiting for it to stop, which it always did. About a month in, I mentioned it to the building manager. He was an older guy, probably in his 50s, who lived on the first floor. He shrugged it off, said he hadn't heard anything like that from anyone else. Told me it was probably just pipes or the building settling, something like that. I didn't buy it, but I let it go. There wasn't much he could do about it. The knocking kept up, though. Always late at night. Sometimes it was so soft I'd wonder if I was imagining it. Other times, it was loud enough to wake me up, pounding like someone was trying to get in. I started to get paranoid. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to start. It was like I knew it was coming, like I could feel it. Then one night, something changed. The knocking was louder than usual, more aggressive. I was wide awake this time, and for some reason, I felt this overwhelming urge to check. I'd never looked through the peephole before. I always stayed in bed, waiting for it to pass, but that night, something in me snapped. I was tired of feeling watched, of being woken up by this strange, endless knocking. I got up slowly, heart pounding, and crept to the door. The knocking stopped as soon as I got close. I stood there for a second, hand hovering over the doorknob, hesitating. Then, I leaned forward and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. I let out a breath, half relieved, half confused. I stood there for a minute, just staring, trying to shake the weird feeling in my gut. Then, I went back to bed. A few nights later, it happened again. Same thing, loud, frantic knocking. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and rushed to the door. As soon as I got close, the knocking stopped. I looked through the peephole, expecting the hallway to be empty again. But this time, there was someone standing right in front of my door. I froze. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Whoever it was, they were standing so close that I couldn't see their face. Just the top of their head, dark hair matted down like they'd been out in the rain. I could see their shoulders, their arms hanging by their sides, but they weren't moving. They were just standing there, inches away from the door, completely still. I backed away slowly, not making a sound, trying to keep my breathing steady. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? Open the door? I wasn't sure what was happening, but something told me not to make a move, not to make any noise. I crept back to my bedroom, shut the door softly, and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, waiting for something else to happen. But it didn't. The knocking didn't come back, and I didn't hear anyone in the hallway. It was like whoever it was had just disappeared. The next morning, I left the apartment as soon as the sun came up. I didn't want to be there anymore. I went to work, tried to focus on anything else, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was that? Why were they standing so close to my door, and why didn't they say anything? That night, I didn't want to go home. I stayed late at the office, dragged out errands, anything to avoid going back. But eventually, I had to. When I got back to the apartment, everything seemed normal. No weird vibes, no strange sounds. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, as soon as I turned up the lights and lay down, the knocking started again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just lie there, waiting for it to stop. I got up, crept to the door, and looked through the peephole. They were there again. Same person, standing just inches away from the door. This time, I could see more. Their face was pressed up against the door, their eyes staring straight into the peephole. It was like they knew I was there, like they were watching me through the other side. I stumbled back, my heart racing, trying not to make a sound. I backed into the bedroom, grabbed my phone, and called the police. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. Something was seriously wrong. When the cops showed up, the person was gone. They searched the building, checked the security cameras, but there was no sign of anyone. The cameras didn't even catch anyone coming in or out of the building. It didn't make sense. After that, I couldn't stay there. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. I didn't go back for a few days, but eventually, I had to. I couldn't afford to break my lease, and part of me thought maybe it was over, maybe whoever it was had moved on. But the first night I was back, the knocking started again. This time, I didn't check. I didn't get out of bed. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The knocking was softer this time, almost like they were tapping their fingers against the door, but it was relentless. It went on for hours. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, waiting for it to stop. When the sun came up, I packed my things and left for good. I never went back to that apartment. I broke the lease, lost my deposit, didn't care. I couldn't stay there anymore. I still don't know who it was, or what they wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knocking in my head. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting. I was passing through a small town on my way back from a long drive, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I'd been on the road for hours and started to feel a headache coming on, probably from dehydration and just sitting too long behind the wheel. I remembered I had a prescription in my glove box from a while back, some headache meds my doctor had given me but I never filled. I figured I'd stop at the first pharmacy I found, get it filled, and then I could make the last couple of hours home without my head pounding. I pulled into this small pharmacy on the corner of a quiet street. It looked old-fashioned, the kind of place you'd see in a movie set in the 1950s. There were only 2 cars in the lot, and I didn't see anyone inside at first, just the lights on and some dusty shelves through the windows. I hesitated before going in, wondering if the place was even still open, but the door wasn't locked and a little bell jingled as I walked in. There was a faint smell, like medicine mixed with something musty. The shelves were filled with the usual stuff, over-the-counter meds, bandages, some toiletries, but it all looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. The counter was at the back, and behind it was a man in a white coat, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with thinning hair and glasses that sat crooked on his nose. He didn't look up right away, just kept scribbling something on a clipboard. "Excuse me," I said, holding up the folded prescription slip. "Could I get this filled?" He looked up then, and his eyes locked onto mine for a second too long before drifting down to the paper I handed him. He took it from me and scanned it over, then nodded slowly. "Sure," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'll get that ready for you. Might take a few minutes. We don't get many people coming in this time of day." I just nodded and wandered around the store while he disappeared into the back. I thought I heard some clattering back there, like bottles being knocked over, but I figured he was just digging around to find the right meds. I picked up a magazine and flipped through it, but the pages were yellowed and old, so I put it back. After a while, the pharmacist came back out and set a small paper bag on the counter. He had this weird little smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes, and I didn't like the way he was looking at me. "Here you go," he said. "That'll be $15. I handed him a 20, and he put the change on the counter without counting it back to me. When I reached for the bag, I noticed the label on the bottle inside wasn't the medication I had been prescribed. It was some other name I didn't recognize, and I pointed that out to him. "Ah, this isn't what I asked for," I said. "This isn't the right medication." His smile stayed fixed in place, but there was a slight shift in his expression, like he was annoyed that I even brought it up. "It's the same thing," he said. "Just a generic version. Does the same job, probably even better." I was pretty sure it wasn't. I wasn't about to take something I didn't recognize, especially not from a place that didn't look like it got much business. "I'd rather have what was on the prescription," I insisted. "I'll wait if you need more time." His face hardened then. "It's the same thing," he repeated, this time with a bit of a bite to his words. "I know what I'm doing. Been doing this a long time." He kept his hand on the bag as I reached for it again, like he wasn't going to let me take it unless I agreed to what he was saying. "I just prefer what I was prescribed," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Or maybe I'll just get it filled somewhere else." His hand tightened around the top of the paper bag, and he leaned across the counter a little. "You're not going anywhere until you take what I gave you," he said, and his voice was low and steady, almost like he was trying to threaten me without raising his voice. A chill ran through me. I didn't know if he was just some old guy with a bad temper or if something was seriously wrong here, but I wasn't about to argue with him anymore. "All right, fine," I said, taking the bag from him. "I'll just take this and be on my way." As I backed away from the counter, I saw his eyes following me, watching every step I took toward the door. The moment I pushed the door open, I heard him say, "Take it as soon as you can. It'll work better that way." There was something off about the way he said it, like there was a hidden meaning behind the words, and I didn't wait around to find out what he meant. I got to my car and tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out of that lot as fast as I could without peeling out. When I was a few miles out of town, I finally took the bottle out of the bag and looked at it closer. It wasn't even close to what I had been prescribed. The label didn't match anything I'd heard of, and when I searched the name on my phone, I couldn't find any results for it. No information at all, like it didn't exist. The pill color was different too, a pale blue instead of the white ones I'd been prescribed. I wasn't sure what I'd just been given, but I knew one thing: I wasn't about to swallow any of it. I pulled over and tossed the whole bag into a trash bin at the side of the road. Then I just sat there for a few minutes, trying to shake the feeling that I'd just escaped something that could have gone very wrong. I don't know if it was some kind of scam, or if the guy was testing something out on me without saying it. Maybe he was trying to see if I'd even notice he gave me the wrong thing. All I know is, the whole time I was there, he acted like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to do exactly what he wanted. And when I didn't, his whole demeanor shifted, like he had a plan that didn't go the way he expected. I ended up calling my doctor and telling him what happened. He seemed just as confused as I was and said it was a good thing I didn't take the pills. He told me to just come into the office and get a new prescription. I didn't mention the name of the town or the pharmacy because, to be honest, I wasn't even sure if I remembered the name right. It was just a blur after that. I just kept driving until I felt like I was far enough away from there. I still get a chill when I think about that guy's eyes, the way he stared at me like he was trying to figure out if I was going to play along or push back. And the way he held onto that bag, like he wasn't going to let me leave without it, still gets to me. I haven't stopped at a small-town pharmacy since. I just don't trust them anymore. My car broke down late in the afternoon. I was about halfway through my road trip, somewhere in a town I didn't even catch the name of. I'd been driving for hours, and the engine started making a knocking sound. I thought it was the kind of thing I could push through, just get to the next city or even a rest area, but after another few miles, it just died completely. I coasted onto the shoulder and sat there for a minute, just staring at the dashboard, hoping it'd start right up again, but it didn't. The engine didn't even turn over. I was stuck. There wasn't much around, just a small auto shop down the road. It was the only place I'd seen for a while. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but I couldn't get a signal. I remember feeling that sinking feeling in my stomach, realizing I have to walk over there. It wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile, but I felt exposed out there on the open road with nothing but fields on either side. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across everything. I reached the shop, and it looked like it had been there forever, one of those places that seems frozen in time. The paint was peeling off the walls, and there was a sign out front that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. There was a man behind the counter, older, with a scruffy beard and a stained blue jumpsuit. He glanced up when I came in. "Car trouble?" he asked, though it was pretty obvious. I told him what happened, and he said he could take a look but wouldn't be able to get any parts until the next day. He offered to tow my car back to the shop for a fee, and I didn't have much choice, so I agreed. We took his old tow truck back up the road, and he hooked up my car without saying much. Back at the shop, he had me pull up a chair in the waiting area while he started checking under the hood. The place was cluttered, like 100 projects had been left half-finished. There was a faint smell of oil and metal, the kind that gets in your nose and sticks. I sat there, just hoping it wouldn't be a big fix. After what felt like an hour, he came back in and said the engine was shot. Something about a blown head gasket, though he wasn't clear on the details. He said there was no way he'd be able to fix it until tomorrow at the earliest. I was stuck there for the night. "You can sleep in here if you want," he said, like it was nothing. Got a cot in the back, not the best, but better than the car. I didn't like the idea, but the town was so small, I doubted there was a motel around, and I didn't see any other options. I asked him how much it'd be to fix the car, and he just shrugged, like he hadn't thought about it yet. "Depends on what I gotta do," he said. "We'll figure it out in the morning." I didn't feel right about it. Something about the whole thing seemed off, but I told myself I was just tired. I went to the cot he'd set up in the back, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, little clinks and clatters from outside. I told myself it was just him working on something, but it didn't sound like tools. It was more like footsteps, and sometimes they seemed too close to the window near where I was lying. After a while, the noises stopped, and I finally drifted off. I woke up suddenly to a faint scraping sound, like metal on metal. It was coming from the direction of my car. I got up and walked out to the shop floor. The man was standing by my car, his back to me. He was working on something, but I couldn't see what it was. When I got closer, I noticed he'd taken one of the wheels off and had the hood propped open again. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the empty shop. He didn't look up. "Thought I'd get a head start," he said. "No harm in getting things ready for tomorrow." Something wasn't right. I mean, who works on a car in the middle of the night like that? I stepped closer, trying to see what he was really doing, and I saw that he had my car battery out and a few other parts laid out on a cloth. It didn't look like he was fixing anything, it looked more like he was taking it apart. "I thought you said it was too late to work on it," I said, and that's when he finally turned to look at me. His eyes were dark, like they were set too far back in his skull, and there was something in his expression that made my skin crawl. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't need to be out here." I felt a jolt of fear run through me, but I forced myself to keep calm. I mumbled something about being restless and backed away, heading back to the cot. But I didn't go back to sleep. I just sat there, my heart pounding, listening for more sounds. I didn't know what his deal was, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around to find out. When I was sure he wasn't looking, I crept back out to the shop floor and checked my car. He'd taken out more than just the battery. There were a few other parts missing, stuff I didn't recognize. It looked like he was making sure it wouldn't be able to start again. I glanced back toward the office and saw him coming out, wiping his hands on a rag. I ducked down behind the car just in time. He walked right past where I was hiding, muttering to himself. He went over to a cabinet and pulled out a tool I didn't recognize. It had a long handle and a sharp edge, and he gripped it like he knew exactly how to use it. I didn't wait to see what he was planning. I crawled around to the other side of the car, trying to stay out of his line of sight. My hands were shaking, and I didn't know if I could make it to the front door without him noticing. I was halfway there when I heard him say, "Where do you think you're going?" I didn't look back. I ran for the door, yanking it open and bolting outside. I heard his footsteps behind me, the door slamming shut. I took off down the road, my lungs burning, not even sure where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away from him. I saw some lights up ahead and realized there was a diner about a mile down the road. I kept running, even though my legs were screaming at me to stop. When I finally reached it, I burst through the doors, gasping for breath. The woman behind the counter looked up, startled. "Are you okay?" she asked. I didn't even know what to say. I just shook my head, pointing back down the road toward the shop. She called the police, and when they showed up, I told them what happened. They went to the shop, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The place was locked up like nothing had happened, but they found the tools he'd been using, and my car was still half disassembled. The police didn't seem too surprised when I described the man to them. They said he'd been a problem before, though they didn't go into details. They towed my car to another shop in a different town, where it finally got fixed. I never found out what his real intentions were, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't been back through that area since, and I don't plan on it. There's just something about being stranded in a place where no one knows you, where there's nowhere to run, that still makes me uneasy. I first noticed him a couple of months ago, just standing there at his window. At first, I thought it was nothing. Maybe he just happened to be looking outside as I left for work in the morning. It didn't seem like much at the time, but it kept happening. Every single day. I'd leave my house and, like clockwork, he'd be there, standing at his window, just staring out. At me. It started to get to me. The way he'd stand so still, just looking down at me from the second floor, like he was watching every move I made. It wasn't like he was just glancing out, he was focused. There wasn't even any attempt to look casual about it. I'd catch his eyes on me as I locked my door or walked down the path, and he never looked away. It made me uneasy, but I told myself I was being paranoid. People are allowed to look out their windows, right? Then one evening, I was coming back from work later than usual. It was getting dark, and I was tired. I parked my car and started walking up the path to my door when I saw something lying on the ground. It was a piece of folded paper. I picked it up, thinking it might have been some flyer someone left behind, but as soon as I unfolded it, I realized it wasn't that. It was a note, handwritten in messy letters that looked like they'd been scrawled down quickly. The words on the note, they were describing my routine. Leaves the house at 7:15 every morning. Comes back around 6:30 most nights. Sometimes runs late on Wednesdays. Usually picks up groceries on Sundays. It went on like that, listing things I did almost every day. The times I'd been out late with friends, the mornings when I'd gone for a jog instead of driving to work. There were details in there that even I didn't really think about. Things like the fact I've watered my plants every 3 days, or that I'd usually check my mail in the morning before I left. It took a minute for it to sink in, but then my stomach dropped. Someone had been watching me, really watching me. Keeping track of what I did, when I did it, and writing it all down. I looked up at his window. It was dark, but I could just barely see a figure standing back in the shadows. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew it was him. It had to be. He was the only one who would have been able to see all of that from his window. I went inside, locking the door behind me quickly, my hand shaking as I twisted the deadbolt. I stood there in my entryway for a while, just listening, trying to calm down. I kept expecting to hear footsteps outside, or a knock at the door, but there was nothing. Just the usual evening noises from the neighborhood. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my neighbor was looking out his window too often? That someone left a creepy note on my doorstep? I wasn't even sure if they would do anything about it. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe it was just a prank, some kid messing around. But deep down, it didn't feel like that. It felt personal. For the next few days, I tried to change up my routine. I left at different times, took different routes, anything to make it harder to keep track of me. But every time I went out, I still saw him there, standing at his window. It didn't matter if it was early in the morning or late at night. If I was coming back from work or just stepping out to get the mail. He was always there, watching. One night, I decided I needed to do something. I thought maybe I'd go over and confront him, or at least ask him what his deal was. It was late, almost midnight, and his lights were on. I could see him at the window again, but this time, he was standing closer, his face almost pressed up against the glass. I could see his eyes clearly for the first time. They were just staring straight at me, wide and unblinking. He didn't look away, not even when I stepped closer to the edge of my property. I hesitated, suddenly unsure if I should actually go up to his door. Something about the way he was looking at me made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was intense, like he was studying me. I could feel his eyes following me as I backed away and turned toward my own house. The next morning, I found another note. This time, it was taped to my front door. It wasn't a list like before. It was just a few lines, written in that same scratchy handwriting. Why don't you come over? I know you've noticed me. I've seen you looking back. That was enough. I called the police that day. I told them about the notes, about him always being at the window, and how it was making me feel unsafe. They sent a couple of officers over, who talked to him for a few minutes, then came back to me. They said he didn't admit to anything and that it wasn't illegal to stand at a window in your own house. They'd keep an eye on things, but there wasn't much they could do. I felt frustrated, like they weren't taking me seriously. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something, like footsteps outside my window or the creaking of the floorboards in the hallway. I was starting to think I was going crazy. The next day, I decided to stay with a friend for a while, just to clear my head. When I came back home a few days later, it felt different. The house was quiet, too quiet. It didn't feel like mine anymore, like something had changed while I was gone. I checked all the rooms, making sure everything was in place. but there was nothing out of the ordinary. But as I walked back toward the front door, something caught my eye. A small, black USB drive was sitting on the doormat, like it had been left there on purpose. I hadn't seen it when I first walked in, so it must have been put there while I was inside. I took it inside, not sure if I should even touch it. It could have been anything. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I plugged it into my laptop. There was only one file on it, a video. It was dark and grainy, like it had been taken on a phone camera with a shaky hand. I recognized the angle almost immediately. It was from his window, pointing directly at my house. It showed me coming and going, day after day. There were even videos of me inside my house, through the windows, doing everyday things, cooking, watching TV, even sleeping. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up. I pulled the USB drive out and ran to the phone to call the police again. This time, they took it more seriously. They came over and checked everything, but when they went to his house, no one answered the door. They said they'd come back with a warrant, but by the time they did, the place was empty. He was gone. I haven't seen him since. I don't know where he went, and I don't care to find out. I moved a couple of months after that, to a new town. I keep my curtains closed all the time now, and I don't stay in one place for too long. I still think about those videos sometimes, about how long he must have been watching me before I even noticed. How he knew everything about me, things I didn't even realize about myself. It makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. I don't know what he wanted, or what would have happened if I'd stayed any longer. I just know that I was lucky to get out when I did. The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. We were both stuck in this tiny, cramped airport terminal waiting for a delayed flight. It was late, past midnight, and most of the people around looked exhausted. I was tired, too, but I was still awake enough to notice things around me. He caught my eye, mostly because he was the only other person awake, pacing around like he had somewhere urgent to be. He eventually sat down across from me. He smiled, and I smiled back out of politeness. He seemed normal at first. He had a tired face, maybe mid-40s, and wore this old, worn-out jacket like he'd been traveling a long time. I could relate, so when he asked if he could sit closer, I shrugged and said sure. We both had hours to kill anyway, so a little chat seemed harmless. He introduced himself as Mike and asked where I was headed. I told him I was flying back home, and he nodded, saying he was flying to the same city. He kept the conversation going, asking about my job, my family. I was a bit surprised by how many questions he asked, but I figured maybe he was just a talkative guy. He was friendly enough, so I answered, trying not to give away too much. After a while, he started talking about his life. He'd been a truck driver, always on the road, always moving. He had a few kids, but said they didn't keep in touch. He sounded lonely, and I felt a bit bad for him. We talked on and off for the next hour or so, and though he seemed a bit intense, he didn't say or do anything that really bothered me. Not at first. But after a while, something changed. He stopped smiling as much and started asking different kinds of questions. Personal questions, things about my routine, my schedule, whether I lived alone. It made me uncomfortable, and I tried to steer the conversation somewhere else. But he kept circling back to me, almost like he was studying me. His eyes never left my face. I tried to give shorter answers, hoping he'd get the hint. When the announcement finally came over the speakers that our flight was ready for boarding, I felt a huge wave of relief. I stood up, saying something about needing to grab my things, and turned to leave, hoping he'd stay behind. But he stood up right after me, following close, too close. I figured maybe he was just eager to get on the plane, but he kept standing there, just watching me. I told him, in the nicest way I could manage, that I'd see him on the flight, and tried to make my way toward the boarding line alone. But he didn't leave. He followed me into the line, standing right behind me, not saying a word. I looked around, hoping someone else would notice how close he was standing, how uncomfortable I looked, but everyone was busy, too tired or too distracted to notice. When I finally got to the front and handed my boarding pass to the attendant, he was still there, right next to me. The attendant glanced at him and asked to see his boarding pass, too. But he didn't pull one out. Instead, he turned to the attendant, his face dead serious, and said, "I'm with her. We're together." I felt my stomach drop. I stammered something, tried to tell the attendant that no, we weren't together. I didn't even know him. But he kept insisting, saying we were a couple, that we'd been sitting together the whole time. I could see the attendant's face shift, going from confusion to suspicion, and I felt myself start to panic. I tried to explain, but he kept interrupting, getting louder and more insistent. Finally, I looked right at him and told him to leave me alone, that I didn't know him. The attendant looked between us, clearly unsure what to do. I was about to ask her to call security when he suddenly backed off, giving me this strange, hard look. He said, "All right, if that's how it is," and turned to walk away. The attendant let me board, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but he was gone. I took my seat, trying to breathe, trying to convince myself it was over, that he'd just gotten a bit too attached, a bit too lonely. But a few minutes later, as I was buckling in, I saw him again. He was standing at the entrance to the plane, talking to one of the flight attendants. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he kept looking down the aisle, looking right at me. I felt trapped. I wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I sank into my seat, praying he wouldn't come any closer. The flight attendants eventually shook their heads, and he was forced to leave. He shot me one last look as he turned away, his eyes cold and furious. The door finally closed, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The rest of the flight was tense, but at least he was gone. When we landed, I grabbed my bags and rushed out, practically running through the airport. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me again. But he wasn't there. I took my dog, Max, to the local park every evening. It was a routine that I cherished. The park was usually quiet at that hour, and I appreciated the fresh air and a chance for Max to run around. On this particular evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. The air felt crisp, and I could hear the distant laughter of children playing. As we walked along the path, I noticed a group of teenagers sitting on a bench. They seemed to be having a good time, laughing and joking among themselves. I didn't pay them much attention at first. Max was busy sniffing at the ground, his nose buried in the grass. I moved a little closer to the edge of the path to give them space as I walked by. As I approached, I heard them whispering to each other. I could feel their eyes on me, but I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Max. Just as I passed them, I heard one of them say my name. It was strange because I had never seen any of them before. I looked back over my shoulder, and they were all standing now, still whispering. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you just say my name?" I asked, my voice steady, though I felt a knot in my stomach. They all looked at each other, and one of them, a girl with short black hair, stepped forward. "We just wanted to talk to you," she said, her tone light but her eyes intense. "We know you." I frowned, feeling a mixture of confusion and unease. "You know me? From where?" They exchanged glances again, and my unease deepened. I turned to walk away, urging Max to keep moving, but then I heard it. "Come on, don't be like that. We just want to have a little chat," another one called out. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Max seemed to sense something was off too. He stayed close to my side, his ears perked up. But when I looked back, I saw they had started following me, their whispers growing louder. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my heart racing. "Because we need to talk, Tom," the girl said again. My heart sank. How did she know my name? I had not introduced myself, nor had anyone in the park called out to me. I turned a corner, hoping to lose them, but they were persistent. They continued to follow at a distance, just close enough that I could hear snippets of their conversation. "He thinks he can ignore us," one of them said. I could feel panic rising within me. I glanced around, looking for other people in the park. It was still relatively empty, and the sun was nearly gone. I decided to head toward the playground, thinking there might be some parents around. As I approached, the group picked up their pace. "You don't need to run, Tom. We are just friends," the girl called out, her voice dripping with mockery. I felt a wave of anger mixed with fear. "I don't know you," I shouted back, trying to sound more assertive than I felt. They laughed, and it sent chills down my spine. I reached the playground, hoping to find someone who could help, but it was empty. I glanced over my shoulder, and they had stopped a few feet away, standing just outside the light from the playground's lamps. I could see their silhouettes, but their expressions were hidden in the darkness. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Because we can, Tom. You are in our territory now," the girl said, and the others laughed again. The words echoed in my mind. I felt trapped, like I was in a game I didn't understand. I looked at Max, who was still by my side, his fur bristling. I took a deep breath and decided it was time to confront them. I had to protect Max and myself. "Leave me alone," I said, trying to sound firm. One of the boys stepped forward, smirking. "We just want to talk, really. We know what you did." "What I did?" I felt my heart drop. "I don't even know you." They advanced a few steps, and I stepped back instinctively, my mind racing. I had to find a way out of this situation. I looked for another path, but the layout of the park was disorienting in the dark. I took a few steps back, thinking maybe I could make it to the parking lot where my car was. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, and saw it was just a dad picking up his child from the playground. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Hey, you all right?" he asked, noticing the tension in my body. "Not really." I began, but then the group of teenagers shifted, moving closer. The dad noticed, his expression changing. "You need to leave him alone," he said firmly, stepping in front of me. The teenagers paused, exchanging uncertain glances. "We were just talking to him," the girl replied, but I could see the intimidation flickering in her eyes. "Whatever you think you are doing, it is not okay." "Back off," he said, and I felt a surge of gratitude. The group hesitated, and for a moment, I thought they might retreat. But then the boy who had spoken earlier laughed, trying to appear nonchalant. "We were just having some fun." The dad didn't back down. "Not here. Leave. Now." With one last glare at me, they turned and began to walk away, whispering among themselves. I could not shake the sense of relief and disbelief. They were really just leaving? Once they were far enough away, I took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly leave my body. The dad turned to me, concern still etched on his face. "You okay? Do you want me to walk you to your car?" I nodded, grateful for the offer. "Yes, please. I'm not sure why they were following me. I have never seen them before." He kept a protective stance as we walked, and I felt safer with him nearby. "People can be strange," he said, shaking his head. "You did the right thing by not engaging with them." Max stayed close, and I felt a surge of affection for my dog. He had sensed the danger, and I realized how much I relied on him. We reached my car, and I quickly unlocked the door. The dad stood by, ensuring I got in safely. "If you see them again or feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call the police," he said. "Thank you," I replied, feeling the weight of the encounter finally lift. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty park behind me. I drove home, reflecting on how quickly things could escalate. The park, once a safe haven, had turned into a scene of intimidation. I vowed to stay alert and to trust my instincts. I had learned a hard lesson about being cautious, and I would not forget it anytime soon. Max curled up in the passenger seat, and as I drove into the night, I felt a renewed sense of vigilance. I would not let fear control my life. I worked the night shift at a mortuary. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and there was a kind of peace to it. You're alone with the dead, and they don't ask for much. Just keep things tidy, make sure paperwork's in order, and stay out of the way of grieving families. One night, it was around 2 a.m., and I was logging in entries in the visitor's book. Most people don't come by late at night unless it's an emergency, so I was surprised when the front door buzzer went off. It was a man, probably in his 50s, dressed in a dark jacket, cap pulled low over his face. He looked tired but calm. "I'm here to see my sister," he said, and he sounded quiet, kind of sad. I asked for her name, and he said, "Margaret." I flipped through the log, but there was no Margaret on the list, at least not in the last few weeks. I asked him to wait and went to check the records. It's not unusual for someone to come in, thinking they had permission to see a relative only to find out there was a mix-up with the paperwork. But there was no record of any Margaret. I went back to the desk, told him there wasn't anyone by that name here, and he just stared at me, looking confused. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I was here just last week." I double-checked. Nothing. He sighed, looked like he was thinking something over, and then he thanked me and left. I felt a little sorry for him, thinking maybe he was just confused, or maybe it was the stress of grief. People forget things, or think they remember something that didn't happen. But then he came back the next night. Same time, same tired look on his face. Same request. He didn't seem frustrated or anything, just determined. "I'm here to see my sister, Margaret," he said again, like the night before hadn't even happened. I checked the logs, even though I knew I'd find the same result. No Margaret. No record of anyone related to him. I told him the same thing as the night before, that there was no one here by that name. He just nodded slowly, looking disappointed, and walked out without another word. After that, he showed up every night. Always around 2 a.m., always asking to see his sister. He'd sign the visitor's log each time, but there was never any paperwork to back up his visit. And every night, I had to tell him the same thing. There was no one here by that name. I started feeling uneasy about it. There was something strange about the way he looked at me. He didn't argue or complain. He just had this look, this fixed stare, like he was waiting for me to say something different, like he thought I was hiding something from him. One night, after he left, I decided to go through the records again. I dug back, weeks, months. No one named Margaret had been here in ages. But his signature was in the visitor's log every night for the past week. Every night, same time. The next night, I was ready to tell him he couldn't come back. I figured he was some poor guy who'd gotten his wires crossed, or maybe he had memory issues. I was nervous when he showed up again, same routine, same tired look. But this time, he seemed different. His eyes were a little wild, darting around the room like he was looking for something or someone. He looked at me, almost pleading, and asked, "Are you sure?" "I know she's here. I just want to see her." I shook my head, tried to keep calm, but I felt something heavy settle in my chest. I told him no one by that name was here, that I'd checked. I could see his face tighten, his jaw clench. He didn't say anything, just nodded and laughed. But he looked back as he went out the door, and for a second, I thought I saw something in his eyes, a kind of anger. That was the first night I felt afraid. He didn't come the next night, and I thought maybe he'd finally gotten the message. But around 2 a.m., I went to log the entries, and I saw his signature there. Clear as day. Same looping scrawl, same time. I stared at it, trying to wrap my head around it. I hadn't seen him come in. The door buzzer hadn't gone off. I was the only one with a key, the only one on shift. But his name was in the log, just like it had been every night before. I checked the security footage, expecting to see him walk in like he always did. But there was nothing. Just me, sitting at the desk, the empty hallway behind me. I rewound, watched it again, trying to find something, anything. But there was no sign of him. The following night, I almost didn't want to go in, but I needed the job. I kept telling myself it was just a mistake, some kind of glitch, that I'd misremembered something. Around 2 a.m., the buzzer went off. I went to the door, and there he was, standing in the entryway. This time, he didn't even ask. He just stared at me, his eyes tired and dark, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "I know she's here," he whispered. "I know you're keeping her from me." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's no one by that name here. You have to leave." He didn't move. Just kept staring, like he was waiting for me to break. I tried to explain again, said I checked the records, that there was no Margaret. But he just shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on mine. "You don't understand," he whispered. "She's here. I saw her. I know she's here." I took a step back, feeling my heart race. "Please, you have to go," I said, louder this time. He didn't argue, didn't shout. Just looked at me, his face a mixture of sadness and anger, like he couldn't understand why I was lying to him. Then he turned and walked out, and I watched him disappear into the darkness outside. That was the last time I saw him. He never came back after that. But every night, at exactly 2 a.m., his signature would show up in the visitor's log, the same looping scrawl, as if he'd been there all along. I left the job not long after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still looking for her, still waiting for someone to tell him the truth. And sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's watching, like he's waiting for me to slip up, to finally tell him where she is. I was working late again, finishing up some last-minute paperwork that needed to be filed by morning. I wasn't usually the last one in the office, but that night, It felt like everyone else had cleared out hours ago. When I finally got everything wrapped up, it was well after midnight. The building was quiet, and the hum of the lights in the hallways was the only sound as I made my way down to the parking garage. It was the same way it always was, silent, dimly lit, the type of place where the sound of your own footsteps feels loud and makes you glance over your shoulder. I parked on the second level that day, closer to the elevators, since I was planning on leaving late. Most people don't like parking there, because the lights flicker, and the whole level has a musty smell. But I thought it would feel safer, being nearer to the elevator. I wasn't so sure anymore. I stepped out into the lot, and that uneasy feeling washed over me as soon as I rounded the corner and saw the emptiness stretching out, just rows of cars in a dim space with concrete pillars casting long shadows. I shook it off and focused on getting to my car, not really expecting anything. But as I got closer, I noticed someone standing a little ways off, near the wall by the stairwell. A man, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, leaning against a pillar like he was waiting for someone. I immediately felt uncomfortable. I tried to ignore him, hoping he wouldn't notice me, but as soon as I was close enough, he straightened up and started walking toward me. I felt my heart speed up, and I gripped my keys tighter, moving a little faster. I could hear his footsteps, though he was coming closer, and it didn't seem like he was going to walk past me. Right when I got to my car, I heard his voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss?" I turned slightly, just enough to see him over my shoulder, not wanting to fully face him. He stopped a few feet away, looking uncomfortable, but in a way that seemed a little forced, like he was pretending to be harmless. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I can't seem to find my car." I tried to be polite, even though every instinct was telling me to just ignore him. "I haven't seen any other cars down here tonight," I replied. "Maybe it's on a different level?" He gave a small, nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm pretty sure it was here. I parked in a hurry, so I could have sworn it was around here somewhere." He glanced around, then back at me, and his smile faded a bit. "Do you think you could give me a ride to the exit? I just need to get to the street and call for help." I swallowed hard, trying not to let the panic show on my face. "I'm sorry," I said, shaking my head. "I can't help you." I turned back to my car, pulling the door open as quickly as I could. But before I could get inside, he took a step closer. "Please," he said, his voice more insistent this time. "I just need to get out of here. My phone died, and it's freezing out here. It won't take long." I kept my back to him, hoping he'd take the hint. "I'm sorry, I have to go." I tried to get into the car, but his hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the door before I could close it. His grip was strong, his knuckles white, and for a moment, I froze, my mind racing, trying to think of what to do. "I wouldn't ask if I had any other option," he said, his voice calm, too calm, like he was used to people saying no, and he'd learned how to push just the right way. "I just need a ride down to the entrance. You can drop me off right there. It's not safe for me to walk down alone." I kept my eyes down, but I could feel his gaze on me, that same calmness in his voice turning into something sharper, more intense. He wasn't asking anymore, he was telling. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew I couldn't let him in the car. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look up at him, meeting his eyes with as much confidence as I could muster. "Let go of my door," I said, my voice steady but firm. For a moment, he just stared at me, his face blank, and I thought he might try to force his way in. But then, slowly, he let go, his hand falling back to his side. He didn't step back, though. He just stood there, staring at me with a look that made my skin crawl. "Fine," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I get it." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. I didn't even check my mirrors as I backed out, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. But as I pulled out of the spot, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, standing there, watching me, his expression dark, unreadable. I drove out of the garage as fast as I could, my heart racing, my hands shaking on the wheel. I felt a surge of relief as soon as I was out in the open, under the streetlights, away from that empty concrete space that had felt so suffocating. I didn't go back to work the next day. I called my boss and told her what happened. She didn't say much, just told me to take the day off and rest. I could tell she didn't really believe me, thought I was just overreacting or something. But I knew what I'd felt, that cold, creeping fear that had settled into my bones, that feeling that something wasn't right, that he'd been waiting there, just for me. The days passed, and I tried to forget, to push it out of my mind. But every time I thought about it, I could still see his face, that blank, empty look, and hear his voice, that calm, insistent tone that had made my skin crawl. I started parking closer to the building, under the lights, where I could see anyone who might be waiting. I made sure to leave work before it got too late, to never be the last one in the office. And every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, watching, waiting. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I had just finished a long shift at the office. I was tired, my mind was foggy, and all I wanted to do was get home and get some sleep. My car was running fine, nothing unusual. But as I turned down a quiet stretch of road, my engine sputtered, and then it just died. I tried restarting it a few times, but nothing happened. I knew I was far from the nearest gas station or anything resembling help. The road was dark, only a few houses scattered here and there, far enough that they couldn't help me in time if something went wrong. I didn't panic, though. I was prepared for moments like this. I pulled out my phone, got on the roadside assistance app, and requested a tow. The app said it would be about 40 minutes before help arrived. Fine. I could wait. I stayed in the car, locked the doors, and tried to make myself comfortable as best I could. About 15 minutes later, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was the tow truck, but the truck kept getting closer and closer, then pulled up next to me. I glanced over, and the driver rolled down his window. "Hey, need a hand?" he asked. I looked over at him. He was in a beat-up pickup truck, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel shirt. At first, I thought he might be a good Samaritan, someone trying to help. But then I noticed something in his eyes, something that made me hesitant. His stare was a little too intense, a little too focused. It felt wrong, like he was eyeing me more than my car. "No, I'm fine," I said, trying to sound calm and polite. "I've called for a tow truck. They should be here soon." The man didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me for a moment, his eyes flicking over my car like he was inspecting it, and then he said, "You sure? I could take a look, help you out. You don't want to wait out here alone." I shook my head. "Really, I'm fine. The tow truck's on the way." There was a long pause. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something in the air changed. I couldn't explain it, but it was like I knew something was wrong. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me or how he hadn't left after I told him I was fine. Then, without saying another word, the man shifted the truck into reverse and slowly started to circle around my car, driving in a wide arc. I watched him through the rearview mirror, feeling uneasy as he drove past me and came around again, slowly, like he was studying the car. I looked around quickly, checking if there were any other cars, any lights from a nearby house. But everything around me was dark. Empty. I locked my doors and rolled up the windows, just to be sure. He kept driving in circles, coming around again and again, like he was looking for something. I started to feel my heart beat faster. Why wasn't he leaving? I didn't need help. Why wasn't he going? I leaned over to grab my phone, thinking I might need to call the tow truck again, or maybe even call the police. But just as I reached for my phone, the truck stopped right in front of me. I froze, my hand still on the phone, unsure if I should make the call or if I was overreacting. The man leaned out of the window, his body half out of the truck, and looked right at me. You sure you don't need help? Looks like you're stuck out here all alone. I could just give you a ride home, get you out of here. His voice had changed. It was softer now, but there was an edge to it, something cold underneath. No, thank you, I said, forcing myself to sound firm. I'm fine. I'm waiting for a tow. Please just go. But instead of leaving, the man did something that made my stomach drop. He got out of the truck and started walking toward my car, not fast, just slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I froze. I felt like I was being watched, studied, trapped in this moment. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to think quickly. I couldn't just sit there. I started the car again, hoping it would work, praying the engine would turn over, but it didn't. Of course it didn't. My only option was to wait. But waiting felt dangerous now. I could see the man approaching the car through the side mirror, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He reached the back of my car, then circled to the front, looking down at the ground like he was inspecting it. I swallowed hard, my breath coming faster now. I didn't know what to do. I tried to think about what I had in the car. There was nothing to use for defense, nothing close enough that I could reach. The man stood by the front of my car for a moment, just staring at the hood, before he leaned down, peering through the windshield at me. He knocked on the window, gently at first. I didn't move, didn't speak. My whole body was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if it could protect me. The man knocked again, this time harder. You know, he said, his voice low, you could at least talk to me. It's not safe out here, especially when you're so far from home. I could help you out. I didn't answer him. I just stared straight ahead, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying not to show how afraid I was. He wasn't just offering help. He wasn't leaving. He was waiting for me to make a move. He stepped back from the car, walked around to the other side, and began to check the passenger side. I could hear the crunch of gravel under his boots as he circled my car again, moving with that slow, methodical pace, like he was searching for something. I watched him through the rearview mirror, trying to calm myself, thinking about what to do next. The tow truck was supposed to be close by. Maybe I could just wait him out. But what if he didn't leave? What if he tried to get in? He came back to the driver's side again and knocked on the window. This time, I jumped. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel the panic rising. Don't make me break that window, he said softly, like it was a casual threat. I can see you're scared, but I'm just trying to help. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I reached for my phone, but just before I could call the police, I saw headlights in the distance. The tow truck. I had never been so relieved to see anything in my life. The man saw the headlights too. He looked back at me, then back at the truck, and his expression changed. The smile faded from his face, and he took a step back. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the tow truck pull up. I didn't move, didn't take my eyes off him. The tow truck driver was a big guy, looked like someone who had seen enough strange situations to not be easily intimidated. When he got out of the truck, the man's eyes flicked between us. He stayed there for another few seconds, then turned and walked back to his truck. "Are you okay?" the tow truck driver asked, eyeing me carefully. I nodded, trying to calm my breathing. "I am now." The man got into his truck and started it up. He didn't say another word. He just backed out of the spot and drove off, disappearing into the night. I didn't stay to watch him leave. As soon as the tow truck driver finished loading my car, I got in, locked the doors, and told him to just take me home. I didn't care about anything else. I just wanted to be as far away from that man as possible. I made it home safely that night, but I still think about it sometimes. How close I came to something worse. How that man didn't just leave when I asked him to. How he just kept circling, looking for a way in. Something about him felt wrong from the start, and I'm just glad I didn't give him the chance to prove it. I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd done it before, but not in this area. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a night or two. I just wanted to clear my head, get away from all the noise back home. I picked a remote spot, pretty deep in the woods, far from any main trails, thinking it would give me some peace. The first night was fine. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and settled in with some basic supplies. It was quiet, just the usual forest sounds around me. I went to bed early, expecting it to be like any other trip. But in the morning, I woke up to find my stuff scattered everywhere. My food was gone, the bag torn open, and the rest of my things looked like they'd been rummaged through. I figured it was some animal, a raccoon or maybe a fox, searching for food. I wasn't thrilled, but it wasn't a big deal. I'd brought extra food, so I could stay another night. I cleaned up the mess, packed my things back up, and decided to take a hike to clear my head. I was out most of the day, exploring the area, getting lost in my own thoughts. By the time I got back to camp, it was already late afternoon. I started up a fire again, had a small meal, and settled in for the evening. It wasn't until I went to get some water from a nearby stream that I noticed something odd. There were these little shapes, arranged in a strange pattern near my tent, made out of twigs. They were small, maybe the size of my hand, but they looked deliberate. Someone had put them there. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured some other camper had passed through and left them. But it did make me feel a little uneasy. I brushed them aside, figuring they were harmless, and went back to the fire. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. But that night, I woke up again, sometime around 3 a.m., to a rustling sound outside my tent. It was faint but steady, like someone was slowly moving around just outside. My heart started pounding. I lay there, barely breathing, just listening. The rustling stopped for a moment, then started again, this time moving closer to where I was. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't like an animal rummaging around, it was more careful. It was like someone was purposefully avoiding making too much noise, but slipping up just enough that I could catch it. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, my eyes wide open, staring at the thin fabric of the tent. The footsteps got closer, and I could see a shadow moving along the side of the tent. It paused right near where my head was, then moved around to the other side. After a few minutes, the sound faded, and everything was quiet again. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, just listening, too scared to even sit up. When the first light started breaking through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent and looked around. There was no one there. But when I stepped outside, I noticed more of those twig symbols, all around my campsite this time, in a tight circle around my tent. They were larger now, more elaborate, and each one looked a little different, almost like they were part of a set. It wasn't just random sticks thrown together. It looked like someone had taken their time, arranging each one carefully. My stomach sank. It was clear this wasn't some harmless prank by another camper. Someone had been here, had come close enough to be right outside my tent, making these things. I tried to calm myself down, told myself maybe it was just some local kids messing around. But deep down, I didn't believe it. This was too far out for anyone to just stumble upon my camp. I decided right then that I was done with this trip. I packed up as fast as I could, barely even bothering to fold my tent properly. I just shoved everything into my bag, constantly glancing around, feeling like I was being watched. It took me about an hour to get everything together, and the whole time, I kept expecting to hear footsteps or see someone lurking in the trees. When I was finally ready, I headed back toward the main trail, keeping my head down, focused on getting out. The woods felt different, like they were closing in on me, every little sound making me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, that someone was watching every step I took. As I got closer to the edge of the woods, I stopped to catch my breath. I'd been moving fast, almost jogging, trying to get as much distance as I could. I looked back one last time, and that's when I saw it. Standing far back among the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. They were too far away to make out any details, but they were tall, and they just stood there, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing through the trees. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were looking directly at me. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like if I moved, they'd come after me. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to turn around and keep walking. I didn't look back again. I just kept going until I reached my car, threw my stuff in the back, and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me. When I finally got home, I tried to rationalize everything that had happened. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was overreacting. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. A few days later, I decided to go through my camping gear to put it away properly. When I opened my bag, I found one of those twig cymbals, carefully tucked inside. It hadn't been there when I packed up.